So all right. The meeting is now being recorded. So give a brief description of our door prizes. We're going to give out 4 door prizes, one during each break and one at the end of each day. And thank you to Bayer. So Bayer, Harry Quick, who's on one of our panelists or one of our panels, donated a bunch of stuff from Bayer. We got this nice buck knife here with Esplanade on the blade. We've got several Rejuvra hats, a package of the High Desert Partnership gear. So a nice Silly Pint hat of the High Desert Partnership, this great little travel silicone dog dish, and a $40 gift card to Shop Harney, which is a bunch of local businesses here in Harney County signed up, and it'll be $40 to one of those businesses in Harney County. And then one last thing, a Yeti Rejuvra coffee mug. So it's a bunch of different stuff. We'll raffle off all that in 4 different packages over the break. And yeah, if you win, we'll call your name out and we'll get a hold of you to get your address to send that stuff over. So I think that's all the sort of doorkeeping things that I had. And with that, I will go ahead and pass it off to Brad Addig, who's going to be the facilitator over the next couple days. Thanks, everyone.
So thanks, Ben. I'm Brad Addig with Foundry Collective and Reinventing Rural. We're an organization that works in rural communities to help spur innovation and entrepreneurship. A few tips for those of you who may or may not have been in a Zoom conference like this before. We ask that you mute your microphone to help keep the background noise to a minimum. So please mute it when you're not speaking. And also, if you are speaking, just be mindful of background noise. If you're on a phone, to unmute, you'll need to press *6. We're also going to ask if during the presentations and the panels that you please keep your camera off. And then I'm looking at names, but in the unlikely event that you've had someone else using your Zoom platform, maybe a little bit of homeschooling, and you find yourself named Baby Yoda, you can go to find the participants list, go to the 3 dots, and you have an option to rename yourself. Also, for those of you not completely familiar with Zoom, in the upper right-hand corner, when you move your mouse up, you're going to see a little box that says View, and you can change your view. So you can select Gallery View and see all panelists at once. And you can also choose to hide your non-video participants, which helps free up some screen area. Using chat, I see everybody is over here using chat. This is where we're going to ask you to please ask your questions of the presenters and the panelists. And we do have 2 people moderating those, and they'll be pulling those chat questions out. And for the panels and the presentations, when we have time for questions, they'll be asking those at the end. So please ask your chat questions there. And then, as Jenna mentioned earlier, if you have any technical issues, just go down where it says "to everyone" and change that to Jenna Stillman, and you can get with her and hopefully get your technical questions asked. And one thing, remember after you put something in the chat to hit enter. One thing you never hear in a virtual conference is where are the restrooms, and I'm hoping they're all down the hall for everyone. So I'm going to introduce Carrie Frickman. Carrie is a graphic recorder and illustrator with Heartwood Visuals, and she's going to be creating this really cool graphic recording today. She's going to be listening in and drawing a visual map of the key themes and the connections from the workshop. So Carrie, please join us. And you're muted, Carrie.
There we go. Thank you so much, Brad. That was a truly perfect introduction. So yes, my name is Carrie. I'm a graphic recorder and illustrator, and I will be creating 2 graphic recordings, one for today's workshop and one for tomorrow's workshop. And I create these now in the virtual world. I used to create them on paper. Now I work digitally on my iPad. So after I do this little introduction, I'll switch over my screen and you all will be able to, instead of seeing my face, you'll be able to see my iPad canvas and see me doing the live drawing and writing of the key themes and the connections that are coming out of all of the great panels and presentations today and tomorrow. So yes, thank you all so much for this great opportunity to draw. My background is in the conservation space, so this type of opportunity is really fulfilling for me to get to do. So thanks very much, Brad.
So we're actually ahead already, and that is awesome because we have so much shoved into today's schedule. We're running today from 12:30 to 4:30, and then as Jenna mentioned, we hope you'll all come back tomorrow at 8:30 to 12:30 for the second half of this. Our next event conversation is the Big Uneasy, Hard Truths of Invasive Annual Grasses, and it's presented by Chad Boyd and Mark Owens. Chad is a rangeland ecologist and research leader for the Agricultural Research Service in Burns, Oregon. He received his BS in wildlife management from Texas Tech University and an MS and PhD in rangeland ecology from Utah State and Oklahoma State Universities, respectively. Much of Chad's current research focuses on restoration of exotic annual grass-dominated rangeland and the relationship between fuel load attributes and fire-caused mortality of perennial bunch grasses. I would not want to have to say that fast 3 times. He works with the diverse partners to develop ecology-based decision support systems for rangeland managers and decision makers. And Mark Owens. Mark serves as the state representative for House District 60, which covers Baker, Grant, Harney, Malheur, and part of Lake County. Mark and his family live and work in Harney County and currently own and operate an alfalfa ranch and custom haying business. So when Mark is not working the ranch and running his 2 local businesses or serving in public capacities, he enjoys traveling with his wife, watching his daughter and son play sports and fishing. I believe at the end of this presentation, we have a few minutes for questions. So please remember, put your questions into chat. And Chad and Mark, welcome.
Okay, I'm going to go first, and let me see if I can share my screen successfully. Which one is the best? This one? Yeah. Are you seeing it? Okay. Can you see my screen and can you see the pointer?
We can see your screen.
Okay.
And we can see your pointer.
Okay. Very good. And
Chad, it looks like you're on presenter view rather than regular view.
Let me try to correct that.
Up at the top, there may be an option to duplicate slideshow or switch. Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
There we go.
And can you see my pointer right above the word Chad?
All good, Chad.
Okay. All right. And I'm going to slip out of view here because I tend to walk as I talk, so I'll probably be distracting. But Mark and I are going to be talking about kind of the complexity of the annual grass situation. And I'm going to start things out from a science perspective. And before I do that, though, I wanted to offer up a quote. And the quote is from George Bernard Shaw and reads as follows: "The reasonable person adapts themselves to the world. The unreasonable person persists in trying to adapt the world to themselves. Therefore, all progress depends on unreasonable people." So this morning, December 14, we had our first person in the United States vaccinated with the COVID-19 vaccine. That was a frontline healthcare worker in New York City, and obviously millions will follow. This last spring, there was a long line of perfectly reasonable people who would have deemed that timeline for vaccine development and approval to be impossible. Thank God for unreasonable people. And the reason I bring that up is twofold. First off, I think that as a country, we need to celebrate victories when we find them. And that's an obvious victory that I think we can all be proud of. Secondly, it's that same sense of unreasonable determination that I think is going to move us forward it's going to take that to move us forward with the annual grass situation. So with that intro, kind of what we're up against with annual grasses, from a science perspective, thinking about the complexity, we're up against a really big problem. And it's gotten to the point where I think acreages don't give it justice. This is a map of the range of one annual grass species, cheatgrass. In North America, the areas that are shaded green have a significant presence of cheatgrass. So it's a huge problem. Put another way, it's big enough that if management can't control it, it will control management and all of the ecosystem services that management provides. So annual grasses have precipitated some changes in the sagebrush ecosystem. And I like to think of those changes in terms of rule changes. Rule change number one is that at large scales of time and space, disturbance frequency used to be in balance with the capacity of the plant community to recover from that disturbance. That is no longer the case. And the big culprit there is fire. We've seen a dramatic expansion of fire in association with annual grasses. And obviously there's some other factors at play here like climate, but we're seeing more and more fire on the landscape such that native plant communities are no longer in balance with disturbance frequencies. The second rule change is a little more complicated. The second rule change is a change in what makes a successful plant in the sagebrush ecosystem. And it's a change from persistence to establishment. It used to be that blue bunch wheatgrass, which I'll point to here in the center of the screen, it was selected in an environment that favored persistence. And that's important because blue bunch wheatgrass and other large perennial bunch grasses are basically the glue that holds our system together. That large root mass you see on blue bunch in the center there, that helps to preclude establishment of annuals. For large perennial bunch grasses, occupy the space that would otherwise be occupied by annuals within the annual grass zone. And when blue bunch was evolving, it evolved to persist, and it evolved over millions of years to persist. That's why it has a big root system. And the reason persistence was important is because resources were incredibly variable, still are, in the sagebrush ecosystem. And so when those resources were available, it needed a big root system to capture as many of them as possible, as quickly as possible. But that all changed with cheatgrass. And establishment, I would argue, now matters more than persistence. And this has resulted in a phenomenon that I like to think of as temporal compression. And to illustrate temporal compression, I'll give a quick example. If this were 1850, the plant community that you see in front of you, let's say that thing burns. Well, if it burns, and it took, let's say, 30 years to get perennials back into that system after the fire, that's no big deal because there was nothing waiting in the wings to take over. Now we see a temporal compression around establishment. In other words, if that plant community burns today, and there's a balance of annual grasses and perennials in the understory, if it burns today, we've got 1 or 2 years to get those perennials established. Otherwise, what are we going to have? We're going to have an annual grass monoculture. Okay, that's a problem. And that establishment is doubly difficult because if you look in the lower right, at the inset photo on the left, we have a few cheatgrass seedlings. That's what their root system looks like as a seedling. And then we have a few blue bunch wheatgrass seedlings that, believe it or not, are the same age on the right. So who's going to win that battle? So temporal compression would be rule change number 2, where establishment is what matters. And we're seeing ripple effects associated with the continued expansion of annual grasses and the changes to our ecosystem. And those ripple effects, to me, really all center around fuels and fire. We've got obviously high fuel continuity of the cheatgrass on the left compared to the perennial bunch grasses on the right. And with that increase in fire, we're seeing a dramatic increase in the expansion of cheatgrass within our region. That's impacting forage availability. It's not that cattle won't graze cheatgrass, it's that cheatgrass production depends strongly on year. Some years it's going to be more available than others. In years when it is available, forage quality can be an issue. Cheatgrass can actually be pretty nutritious when it's young, but this picture was taken in July. And what do you think the nutritional value in July of cheatgrass is going to be relative to perennial bunch grasses? So they senesce early in the growing season, leading to decreased forage quality, obvious ramifications to wildlife habitat. Carbon storage, topic that's coming up with increasing frequency on rangeland, is going to be dramatically impacted by cheatgrasses. Long story short, cheatgrass can store maybe 50% of the carbon that a sagebrush munchgrass plant community could store. So it stores a lot less carbon, and that carbon is a lot less secure because of bullet point number 1. It's more likely to burn. So to offer up just a couple of closing thoughts on that maybe you could use as a framework to think about some of the other material that's going to be presented during this workshop. If we have a strategy for moving forward, it's got to involve doing 2 things well. And one is managing for what's left, which is going to focus on maintaining perennial bunch grasses. And the other is fixing what's broken, getting those grasses back into the system. In terms of hanging on to what is left, this is not really a knowledge limited problem. It's more of an implementation limited problem. And basically, we need to keep the plant communities from burning using fuels management. And when they do burn, we need to have pre-fire fuels management to position those plant communities to come out the back into that fire with low perennial bunchgrass mortality. And there'll be some more discussion of that this afternoon. And the really ticklish problem, the tough one to me, is because it's a knowledge limited problem, is how do we fix what's broken? How do we get, and it's getting to the point where we're going to have to, if we want to maintain a functional ecosystem, we have enough acres that have converted that we're going to begin to have to take some back. And just in the last 10, 15 years, I've seen some changes in the way we think about restoration that give me hope in this area. We're beginning to incorporate ecological principles into restoration techniques and how we think about restoring large landscapes. And we've got some technologies that I think are going to begin to play, some seed amendment technologies that are going to begin to play a role in our success in helping to get perennials back into these broken systems. So I think I'll leave it right there and hand it off to Mark.
Thanks, Chad, and thanks everybody for having me here. I'm supposed to discuss the economic situation of annual invasive grasses. I was trying to figure out what the technical term or the economist term would be to the scale of this problem. And quite simply, I came up with, similar to what Chad said, it's huge. I don't even know how to describe it. There's a couple of things that I'd like to briefly discuss, as Chad brought up. Maybe some of the economic situations of the ripple effect. There's a couple areas in the ripple effect that Chad briefly touched on: forage availability and quantity, wildlife habitat, carbon storage, fuel and fire cycle. So forage availability and quantity. This is huge. Forage availability and quantity. Our communities are based on ag, and grazing on public lands is the largest ag contributor in Southeast Oregon. As we run out of good nutrition feed for those animals, we'll have reduced stocking numbers. As fire takes over the landscape, we will not be allowed to go back onto those for a period of years, depending on the severity of the fire. In 2013, 72% of the Great Basin was found to be infested with annual invasive grasses, mainly cheatgrass. Cheatgrass, besides its extreme year-to-year variation in yield, also provides the fewest days of crude protein above 7.5% when compared to perennial bunchgrass. This monoculture is bad for the range and provides inconsistent grazing opportunities in quality and timing in comparison to perennial bunchgrasses. A range that has a diversity of grasses that exploit all levels of a soil profile do provide adequate forage quality for longer periods of time in the range. So that says a lot, but what does that actually mean directly to the ranchers in Southeast Oregon and maybe the Great Basin in whole? Mayer in 2013 performed a study where they took a mock ranch of 300 head mother cows, and they talked about what annual invasive grasses did to the economic stability of that ranch. To summarize it shortly, they found out that if fire went through that private and public range twice in a 40-year period of record, 24% of those ranches would have 100% chance of going bankrupt. So we could lose 1 in 4 of our ranchers that are currently on the public and private land in Southeast Oregon. That would be a huge disruption to our economic situation in the communities. When we talk about the forage quantity and quality, you also talk about the wildlife habitat that it produces. So when we talk about trying to diversify our economy in Southeast Oregon, we know we're basically natural resource based, but we also understand that we have to augment those education, those economic opportunities. And one of the ways we do that is through wildlife, hunting opportunities, viewing opportunities, public access in order to look at the wildlife. But as annual invasive grasses take over our countryside, our deer populations are extremely going down. You talk in conversations with ODF and W, it's not predation as the #1 concern for mule deer survivability. It is the annual invasive grasses, and they do not have enough nutritional value, one, to make it through the winter and to rebreed. We look at the sage grouse. As we continue to burn up the landscape, there's no place for the sage grouse to go. How can we maintain a minimum number of sage grouse on the land if we can't control fire? And we won't be able to control fire unless we can control annual invasive grasses. So fuel and fire. The fire linkage, I think, is critical. Because fire causes an environment for annual invasive grasses to take over, and the annual invasive grasses produce more of a fire-prone landscape. It's a downward spiral. Unless we figure out how to break that spiral, we won't get out of it. So annual invasive rangelands are 4 times more prone to fires. Historically, the fire regimen for the native range was 30 to 100 years. Once they're dominated with annual invasives, fire returns as often as 5 years. In the United States, expenditures for fire suppression, most of which are in the Western United States in recent years, has approached $1 billion a year. As the prevalence of fire in Western landscapes increases in association with the spread of annual grasses, we risk that becoming the new norm if we cannot get a handle on annual grasses. So ranches, sage grouse, mule deer, or whole public land livelihoods depend on trying to figure out how to control annual invasive grasses. The economic impact currently is huge. So what did Chad say we need to do? There's 2 objective managements in order to potentially restore perennial bunch grasses. The 2 stated objectives are basically 1, keep them from burning and reduce perennial bunchgrass mortality. 2, don't rely on low success practices. Use knowledge of ecology and technology to increase establishment of desired species. So this is where in 2 minutes, I show you how we meet those 2 objectives. But I can't do that, and I imagine the 236 participants on this could do that better than I, because I'm just a political hack. So what I can try to do is try to figure out how possibly we can fund that in order to try to make a significant progress on this, instead of spending the $1 billion a year on fire management for the rest of our lives. We figure out how to restore the landscape. So how do we do that? I believe we do it the way the High Desert Partnership has been doing it. We form the collaboratives. We form the collaboratives so that we can get a broad group of stakeholders. We can all agree on desired objectives. We can all start to educate our state and federal leaders and how that funding needs to go. High Desert Partnership and the Wildfire Collaborative has done a great job on the federal end for that. We also need to build that public-private relationship. We need to get the conservation groups, along with the ranchers, along with state leaders and federal leaders, to agree that this is a significant problem and we need to move forward on it. So how can I help? I can help specifically, possibly at the state level. There's going to be a conversation on wildfires, as you all know, coming into the next long session. There's going to be support for to support the recommendations that came from the Wildfire Council that was produced last year. Bruce Taylor, as many of you know, was very instrumental in getting a significant amount of money earmarked for public range. We need to make sure that we have the opportunity to testify in front of the Natural Resource Committee, the Public Land and Ag Committee, and we need to start selling this. We need to start selling that the state needs to make an investment so that we can multiply that investment into federal partnerships and private partnerships. I could ramble on, but thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Mark. We had one question, and I think you answered part of it, but we have someone that recently moved from the East Coast and just wondering a little bit more about why fire is an issue now. And I think you talked a little bit about, the 30 to 40 year fire coming to every 5 years now. Could you elaborate just briefly on that?
Yeah, so Chad was able to give me several articles so I could try to educate myself a little bit before I spoke on a subject that I never have. And they say that the fire regime in perennial bunch grasses used to be 30 to 100 year interval across the West. So we didn't spend a whole lot of money on rehabilitation. We didn't have to spend a whole lot of time and thought on how to prevent those wildfires, because as I stated, normal first goal was that the fire interval could be maintained and perennial bunch grasses naturally would take back. Now that that interval is shortened, the perennial bunch grass has no ability to establish again. We get back into an annual invasive that likes to come into a fire quickly, and we start reducing that fire interval significantly to the point where we can never no longer get perennial bunchgrass established unless man helps.
And another question, and this is one I was going to ask too, but Megan jumped in here. She says, how much are folks in Salem and then obviously at the federal level aware of the invasive annual grass issue? Because one of the things you said was, it sounds like it's impacting everybody. And this isn't one where someone should be on one side or the other. Everyone should be coming together. But is there enough education at both state and federal level of how this impacts all of the parties that are involved and not just ranchers or not just conservation or not just one, something that each person is most vested in?
I'll try to handle the state and ask Chad to weigh in the federal. So the state, I would say, no, there's not enough education. I was also fortunate enough to sit on the Wildfire Mitigation Committee with Bruce Taylor. And all throughout that discussion last year, multiple meetings, the only time range got brought up was when Bruce would bring it up, and I would try to second it. All the effort on wildfire and invasive annual weeds is in the forest, not in the rangeland. We need to do a lot better job of educating the public on the public extent of this issue. Chad, on the federal issue, you probably have a better idea.
Yeah, and I think that looking at that at two levels, I think within the agencies, people are well aware and on board with the issue. Looking at it more broadly, when you get to the Washington level where things are actually funded, that begins to be a very different story. I think we've seen that with a lot of issues related to rangeland. And sage grouse would be one of those, and sage grouse habitat improvements. It's wild horses are another issue. There's two levels to think about it: the agency level, and then what happens when you get to Washington. And the second one is where I think we could use more education. And I just wanted to agree. Mark gave a fantastic answer to the fire question. The one thing I would add to that, actually just emphasize, is that fire is not an unnatural part of our ecosystems, and there is such a thing still as good fire. It's just that when we have as much fire as we have right now in the presence of annuals, that's when we run into problems. But it's not that fire is an unnatural thing in these ecosystems at all, and we can still have good fire, so to speak.
Thank you. There's two more questions here, and we've got a couple more minutes, so I'm going to just toss these out. One from Sarah: what's the implications of climate change in rangeland quality? Can you speak to that?
So, yeah, with respect to the topic at hand, I'd say two things. Number one, cheatgrass is certainly influencing fire, but there's growing evidence that that climate change is also influencing the amount of fire that we see on the landscape. Another aspect of climate change, though, I think a lot of people think of it as temperature. It's also atmospheric composition. And as we go up in CO2, CO2 fertilizes all plant life. It tends to disproportionately fertilize annual grasses over perennial bunch grasses. And so we could be seeing a new norm with respect to the changing atmospheric composition, with more CO2 actually creating a higher baseline potential for annual grasses.
And you must have seen the next question, because Craig asked if anyone's checked to see about soil carbon credits and increasing take-home income rather than feeding those to grasses to the cows and sheep.
I'd be interested to hear Mark's thoughts on that just really quickly. We're getting more and more questions about that, and certainly seeing more interest at the federal level. And we do have some work going in that direction from a research standpoint.
Great. Well, we got 1 minute, Mark.
Sure. Yeah, I do believe carbon is going to be a discussion for annual invasive grasses moving forward. I think, as Chad said, that the annual invasive grasses do not produce a carbon sink. They actually absorb 50% less carbon. So I believe it's an opportunity that we should be able to take advantage of in this new administration, trying to take the grasslands back to a perennial bunch grass to try to get carbon credits, or more important, in order to try to get money for the restoration of that to make carbon sinks.
Wonderful. Well, listen, I want to thank both of you for taking your time. That was incredibly informative to me, and I'm sure everyone out here. I'd like to introduce Megan Kretsberg, who's going to be talking about the Invasives Initiative and Oregon Partners. Megan is an OSU research associate who's been working on with the Institute for National Resources team since 2010. Megan is currently a technical coordinator for the SageCon Partnership, among several other things, and facilitates discussions on how to best incorporate science-based information into decision-making processes. Megan has her PhD from Utah State University, and welcome, Megan.
Thank you. Can you confirm that you can hear me and see my screen here?
You are loud and clear, and your screen looks beautiful.
Excellent. Great. All right. Well, I'm going to talk today briefly about the SageCon Invasives Initiative. This is an Oregon-specific group to help set the stage for all the great panels that we have coming up. So I need to advance my slide here. Okay. So this gives some context on the scale of the invasive annual grass problem in the state, kind of according to our mapping and numbers. Over 5 million acres are really heavily impacted by invasive annual grasses. Many more are impacted on some level. 3 million acres have burned since 2003. This is just in southeastern Oregon. And so, you know, this is not unique to Oregon. This is a situation that is playing out across the whole Great Basin. Probably not a huge surprise to anyone in the audience. And we know that there's lots of different negative impacts. We just heard about that from our last speakers. What is a little bit different or unique about Oregon is that we have this group called the SageCon Partnership, which is a collaborative group. It's really designed to address these big cross-boundary issues in a collaborative way, like invasive annual grasses. And hopefully many of you were able to tune into our SageCon Summit last week. So invasive grasses are a big focus of the SageCon Partnership. But you know, the problem really hits you when you start to dive into this. How do we even begin to tackle a problem this big? We know it's a big problem affecting millions of acres. We know there's lots of efforts out there to work on it, and we wanted to have the most effective approach for our partnership. What we did first is we broke this down to sort of 3 steps. We started by interviewing practitioners about the barriers to invasive grass management, so we could really hear from folks working on the ground in the field. We convened our big, diverse group of SageCon partners to really define and map out our desired outcomes, threats, goals, strategies to address those barriers, resulting in this colorful concept map that you can see here. And then we narrowed our work down into 3 major focus areas. And these really needed to be specific things where we thought we could make really tangible progress the next year or so on a specific issue to sort of address one of those primary barriers. You know, there is a lot of work going on in a lot of different places. So we wanted to find the most effective ways for the partnership to plug in and add value. So for the rest of this time, I'm going to talk just pretty much solely about the barriers to invasive grass management and this geographic strategy. Okay, so first of all, to get into these interviews on the barriers to invasive grass management, the purpose of the interviews was really to hear from those practitioners in Oregon about the barriers that they're experiencing on the ground, and then use that information to guide the initiative. So you can see sort of the breakdown of the different folks that I talked to. I talked to about 20 people, all in Oregon, but in different sort of roles and agencies and groups. And I asked them a bunch of different questions, but I ended by asking them to rank these 7 areas from the greatest barrier to the lowest barrier. So those areas were financial, policy, technological, coordination, logistical, information, and capacity. And I really gained some great insights from these interviews from this group. Really grateful to all the folks who volunteered their time to do this, and many of them are speakers throughout the workshop. I really can't do these interviews any justice in this talk. I'm going to present one slide on the results, but there's a lot there, and so I'm going to put a link into the chat after I'm done where you can find the summary of those interviews, because there's a lot of good stuff. Okay, so in terms of the results from these interviews, the first big take home was that it is really hard to rank barriers. You know, I was asking these participants to rank 7 things that were all limiting and all really important. And those limitations really vary geographically across the state, I'm sure even more so across the region, and also vary across agencies and then individuals with different perspectives. And it was interesting, for almost all of those 7 factors that I listed out, at least one interviewee ranked it as the most limiting, and another ranked it as the least limiting. So really a lot of variation in those answers. In terms of the top barriers, funding came up as the #1 barrier. Probably not super surprising to many of you. There really was wide agreement that just money alone is not going to solve the problem. And there was a real theme that came out that we need funding for long-term management and really need to beef that up more than just the initial sort of treatment. And we're actually going to be having a discussion of that later tomorrow morning during our panel on prioritizing limited resources and sustaining long-term investment. So the second barrier was policy. So this relates to livestock, fire, other types of policy. One of the biggest take-home messages was that almost every interviewee really brought up the need for grazing flexibility. That was one of the big themes that came out of the interviews. So that's why one of our groups in the SageCon Invasives Initiative is tackling grazing flexibility. And we have a panel later this afternoon on using grazing management to reduce wildfire risk. So we will hear more about that shortly. #3 barrier was technology. The technological barriers are really high. We heard about that a little bit earlier, particularly with native seeds and getting those plants to establish. So there's a panel tomorrow morning, one of the earlier panels on promoting perennials in restoration and management, where we'll hear much more about this. And the 4th ranked barrier out of those 7 was coordination. And so it was really heartening to hear how much everyone really valued coordination and cross-boundary collaboration. That was a real theme that came out of the interviews. A lot of the participants said that coordination has really improved significantly in recent years. There's often room to go, but a lot of progress there. And that coordination really relies on those strong relationships with folks working on the ground. And a lot of those relationships have really been built through our weed management areas and district staff and the infrastructure that is out there on the range. So these are the top 4 ranked barriers. There were a lot of other themes. Again, I will put a link in the chat for more information. One of the other things that came out was that we do need tools to invest our limited funds more wisely. And so I'm going to use that to kind of segue into the second half of my talk on the geographic strategy. So the purpose of this is one of our 3 work groups for the SageCon Invasives Initiative and a real focus range-wide or region-wide on invasive annual grasses. And the purpose of a geographic strategy is really to provide landscape context for this landscape scale problem that is invasive annual grasses. So we can ask ourselves, the questions of where do we usually work and where maybe should we work? These diagrams were borrowed from Jeremy Maestas at NRCS. You're going to hear from him in the next panel to really visualize kind of how that landscape context can help us. So if you look at the diagram on the left here, we know that the proactive approach is more effective, less costly. And then as you move to the more reactive approach, you're trying to fix an area that's really been heavily impacted. The cost goes way up. The failure rates get really high. And the squares here are kind of another way of visualizing this. If you're working in a landscape that's mostly relatively intact with a few weedy patches, you're going to get a lot higher success, a lot more bang for your buck than if you're sort of trying to fix these small patches in sort of a sea of weeds and try to get those areas to hang on. So probably most of you have heard this sort of mantra of defend the core, grow the core, mitigate impacts. Actually, if you've been paying attention and looked at through the agenda, you would notice that this is kind of an organizing theme for this workshop and how we've kind of laid out the different sessions. And this is really piggybacking off of the work that has been done regionally by the Western Governors Association, other states like Idaho and Wyoming, really emphasizing that defending core areas that are still relatively intact is sort of analogous to preventative care in medicine, where you can get to it early, it's much less expensive, high success, and working in the sort of very degraded areas is more like emergency care. And we will need to work in lots of different places of the landscape, but it's really important to have this context and think about keeping your management objectives realistic, depending on where you are. So in Oregon specifically, we're really building from these themes: defend the core, grow the core, mitigate impacts. We took a little bit of a different approach to how we mapped those concepts across the landscape. If you're familiar with some of the, like the WGA toolkit for invasive annual grasses. So what we did is we mapped 3 factors that really guide where we want to focus work on this landscape level. Annual herbaceous cover, we need to know where the things are that we don't want, the annual grasses. Perennial herbaceous cover, we want to know the distribution of the perennials that are really key to keeping that ecosystem together that we want to promote. And then the resilience and resistance of the site really gives us information about how likely a treatment may be to succeed and kind of what our chances are of success in these areas. So we actually produced 2 different maps out of this effort, sort of tailored to different audiences. So this is the Generalized Strategy Map. That's really a broad, simple communication tool. It communicates the strategy to sort of a wide audience, identifies these broad scale patterns. There's just these 3 categories here. And what we hope is that those blue blobs will kind of pop out, identifying these areas of intact core that can be protected and grown. And then the management strategy map is more detailed decision support tool for local planning, local prioritization. It has this finer spatial detail, as you can probably see from the map, and it includes 5 categories where we break down that transitioning zone where it's sort of between the good category and the bad category. It's somewhere in between, and a little bit more information about its restoration potential and some of the factors that might be limiting achieving restoration goals there. Okay, so I'm almost done with my talk and I'm almost out of time, I believe. There are a few ways that we see these maps hopefully being helpful. They can potentially identify opportunities for proactive management. So if you think back to the blue squares and the red squares earlier, here's a real example of more proactive, a landscape opportunity for more proactive management on the left, more reactive, where you just got these little tiny chunks hanging on in the sea of sort of poor condition area. You can map out the direction of management. So here you can see there's a circle around this sort of area that's mostly core, and there's a lot more potential probably for growing that core area to the east than to the west, where that condition is sort of lower and the resilience and resistance is lower. So you could think about, putting planning into place or landowner outreach in some of these areas where you might be able to grow the core. And then I think these maps can also be used to facilitate conversations about shared management objectives. And hopefully this can really be helpful to sort of paint that broader vision for a landscape before you really get into the details of choosing exactly where to work and exactly what tools to use. Okay, so I will wrap it up now. If you want to know more about the Invasives Initiative or the Geographic Strategy, I will put a link in the chat. And we do have a couple of documents up there where you can find out more information. One is sort of a 2-page high-level overview. One is a 6-page more detailed management guide with some examples. And thank you for your attention. And I'm really excited to hear from all the panelists on all these topics later today and tomorrow.
Wow, Megan, thank you so much. Right on time, great information. I was told I might have to play bad cop and push, and it was perfect. So we are right on time, and we're going to go into some more panel discussions. In these discussions, we're going to have 2 panel discussions, and then there is a break at 2:20 to 2:40. However, there's a great 11-minute video going to be played there, so you may want to hang out for that. And I would like to introduce now Jack Southworth, who is going to facilitate the next 4 discussions. Jack is a rancher and facilitator living in Bear Valley near Seneca, Oregon. Jack and his wife, Teresa, own and operate Southworth Brothers Ranch. Jack is committed to finding common ground on natural resources issues and facilitates several collaborative partnerships in Harney County aimed at addressing complex problems that range from forest management to groundwater over allocation. Jack, welcome aboard.
Thank you, Brad. That's a great introduction. And thanks, Chad and Mark and Megan, for setting the table for a great afternoon of panel discussions. Coming up first is defending the core, keeping the good good. And Matt Cahill with the Nature Conservancy out of Bend and is running their Sagebrush C program is first. Matt, do you want to start off our first panel?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Jack. I need to do a quick sharing of the screen. Great. And Jack, can I just verify with you that you can hear me and my screen's showing?
It's really clear, yeah, and your screen's showing.
Awesome. Great. Well, thanks. And hi, everybody. Again, Matt Cahill. I work for the Nature Conservancy, and I'm based in Bend. And together with Jeremy and Mark, we'll be doing a little bit of a panel here to give you a frame on how to stop the spread and really anchor us in what are invasive annual grasses and how can we think about their management. I have the fun job right now of, in a rapid fire way, going through a couple of topics about invasive annual grasses that hopefully tie together what you've heard as the preamble and move us into the panels. And kind of the theme for these quick 10 minutes here are invasive annual grasses, they're just seeds with roots. So many of you, I'm sure, know the players that we're talking about, but just to bring us all up something on the same page, we're really talking about 3 species of invasive annual grasses. Cheatgrass, which you see here on the right, often has that downy appearance when it's growing in a monoculture, but also Medusa head, that more silica-rich grass that is less palatable to livestock and wildlife, often forms a really tenacious thatch when it dries out in the spring. Has this spring green color when you see it at a distance when it's ripening. And then the newest of the 3, really becoming a problem in the last 10 years, Ventonata, sometimes called African wiregrass, has a really fuzzy, hazy, straw-colored appearance to it when you see it in a monoculture setting, and seems to prefer maybe wetter spots on the landscape. But all of these are becoming increasingly problematic in sagebrush systems across eastern Oregon. And then, of course, there are the friends, the other grasses, forbs, both annual and perennial, that tend to come along with these infestations in disturbed areas especially, that form the backbone of our weed communities in eastern Oregon. So not meaning to downplay those other important species, but we're really right now focusing on cheatgrass, Medusa head, and Ventonata. And so where did these troublesome grasses come from? They are old world species. They've come from the Mediterranean climates of Europe and Asia, especially southern Italy, Greece, Turkey, the Middle East, kind of the color yellow you see on the map here. And that Mediterranean climate, it's characterized by having cool, but not cold, wet winters, and then hot, dry summers. That's the climactic pattern that these grasses are evolved to thrive in. It's interesting, I think, to note too, that these are the landscapes where livestock grazing has, where livestock grazing began, where sheep and goat and cattle land management had its origins. So to some degree, these weeds have been following our land management decisions for thousands of years. And follow us, they have, to North America, where you can see on this map, the same colors show up in the West, especially in California. The Central Valley and the Los Angeles Basin are that same color of yellow that you saw on the previous map. And California is indeed an annual grassland these days. You may not know this, but the golden moniker of California is an acquired one. It was a perennial landscape before the Spanish arrived 500 years ago, and is only now an annual condition that turns gold in May, due to an actually pretty diverse annual community, which is part of the reason we don't hear a lot about cheatgrass from California, because they just have so many introduced annual species. But for us, in our colder, drier continental steppe climate, sort of the orange color you see on the map, only a few of those annual species have made the crossover to be suitable in our wetter winters, but colder winters. And it's interesting to kind of reflect on that too. For example, Ventonata is actually rare in Europe. It's a threatened species in a number of European countries. Well, if you were to look at central Russia in a sagebrush or similar steppe system to what we have, cheatgrass is an enormous problem. So climate is part of the factor driving these invasive grasses, but it's not all of it. And that's where I'll just say that invasive species ecology is complicated. It's complex. There are so many factors that determine whether a species is released or suppressed when it arrives in a place that it's not previously been introduced to. But for us, 3 species, Ventonata, Medusa head, and cheatgrass so far, have hit the jackpot when they come to sagebrush ecosystems in the Western US. And they do a good job. They have one job, and that is to reproduce. And reproduce they do. Germinate in the fall, grow slowly in the winter, and then really take off in the early spring to set that seed early in the summer and produce prolific amounts of seed when conditions are good, or just a couple when conditions are bad. But no matter what, they get the job done. You will never find a cheatgrass seedling or cheatgrass plant that hasn't managed to produce at least one seed by the end of its life 1 year in. And like Chad said, that competition is really demanding compared to seedlings of species we prefer. But if we let perennial vegetation get big, competition tables switch, and we find that large perennial vegetation can exclude invasive annual grasses. And it's just that unfortunate dynamic that our perennial vegetation, which is so good at keeping out these noxious weeds, is fit for a former world. Like this little climate graph shows, no 2 years are the same. This shows precipitation at one spot in central Oregon. You just can't count on what any given winter is going to bring. So bunch grasses, they live long, they take few bets, they only need to win 1 out of 10 years. Whereas invasive annual grasses, they need to, and they do win every single year. So if there's a place for those seeds to succeed, they will find it. And they find it by traveling. As you all well know too, these are extremely mobile seeds. They stick to your shoelaces, your socks, the mud on your boots, the mud on your tires, the fur of your livestock, and the scat of plenty of critters that wind up eating invasive annual grass seeds. And so they get around and produce prolific amounts of seeds once established. So part of our management is getting ahead of identifying and getting ahead of those infestations and really beating back that seed bank when it's possible. And that kind of approach of early detection and rapid response can be very effective if you have the tools, resources, and vigilance to find early infestations of invasive annual grass and stay ahead of them. However, we cannot all be ahead of the curve. As this graph this map shows, the redder the landscape, the more annual it has become in our day and age, and much of our landscape has an enormous amount of invasive annual grass pressure already. In those cases, early detection, rapid response is not the most effective tool in the toolbox. And since we're all at different stages of infestation with different species, we need to try to package all of these ideas and tools into something of a framework so we can figure out what to do in the right landscape. And that's where we're kind of proposing, what would some rules of invasive annual grass management look like? So here, turn it over quickly to Jeremy Maestas to touch again on these concepts of being proactive and reactive.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Can you hear me okay?
I sure can.
Perfect. Well, you're going to get to see a couple of figures that Megan showed earlier, but I really feel that we're at a watershed point in the history of annual grass management and how we're thinking about this. And specifically what I'm talking about here is a newer understanding of landscape context. We call it knowing the neighborhood around you, because that context heavily influences your path and your future management outcomes and expectations. And so at a big scale, we want to be thinking about how do we proactively steer resources towards places that are still pretty good, like the blue dominated landscape here on the left, while still mitigating and managing the crises that we always have in more heavily dominated areas. And so we're going to talk more about this later, but this concept of putting the right actions in the right landscapes is also informed by this geographic strategy that you now have for Oregon. Next slide. And again, this concept that we just haven't been very good at in all of rangeland management, which is keeping healthy places healthy, needs to become part of our management mindset. We want to get ahead of the curve, find those places that are still relatively intact, relatively uninvaded, and prioritize our management in those places proactively, so we don't end up in the emergency room providing palliative care to the worst parts of our landscape. Again, as Megan mentioned, it's not that we would never work in those places. It's just that our mindset needs to be changed in those places, and they shouldn't attract all of our attention. And if we have a choice, our first dollar should be going to these places that have a higher likelihood of success long term. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeremy. So to just close this quick preamble, as we move into our panel, just to put out some ideas that are both teaser for this talk about kind of the early side of things, but also talks to come. If you know your neighborhood, if you know which of those zones you're in that Jeremy just described, what is the next step? You know, we're proposing, you got to manage for what is possible in your neighborhood. And just for example, if you're in the defend the core situation, where you still have perennial vegetation, you have productivity, you have resilience to invasive annual grasses, the tools that we think you should be considering are these really proactive early detection rapid response ones of limiting that seed bank, using herbicides in a proactive way with an early response to keep infestations out of your matrix, and then control avenues of introduction, places like roads and pathways that bring in seed, moving livestock from infested pastures to more pristine pastures, and being very careful about disturbance, as that is often the place that invasives start their foothold. If you are more in the grow the core dynamic, where you're in between areas of high resiliency or lower resiliency, your tools probably look different. You know, above all three, you are in the case that you really need to promote your bunch grasses. They are the defense that you have against a downward slide. And that can look like a lot of things, including livestock management to promote perennial vegetation, but also investing in restoration, reintroducing perennial bunch grasses to the landscape where they've been lost, and suppressing the infestations that are, you know, larger and encroaching on your best stuff. And then finally, if you're unfortunately more in a mitigating risk scenario where you do have a large infestation already, you know, these are the landscapes that we really need to prioritize managing fuel loads. They're the places where reestablishing perennial vegetation of any type is most important to try to get an anchor back in a landscape, and then suppressing introductions of other species, since usually there's a bandwagon of other noxious weeds that follow in suit once you have disturbance already set up. And being vigilant of those incoming annual, you know, other annual grass species or annual or perennial forbs is really important to try to limit the deal that you have to work with. And so just to close here, you know, what we're proposing, what I'm proposing here, setting up for hopefully future discussion, is invasive annual grasses are demanding that we have something of a lifestyle change. It is a threat to all of us. It is a threat to every part of this landscape. And every management decision that we make really needs to think about how it can treat invasive annual grasses as part of the decision making. We have to realize that the climate has changed, and some of the patterns that we have expected and counted on in the past are not persisting into the future. But the opportunity is that these shared risks are also shared rewards, that by managing these landscapes for invasive annual grasses, we can improve habitat, we can improve forage, and we can limit some of the more negative side effects that we're getting due to this problem. So thanks for that. And Jack, turning it over to you.
Thanks, Matt. Matt, that's an excellent setup for this. How do we make this change then from our reactive business as usual perspective to a proactive approach? And I understand from your presentation that there are core areas that we can be proactive, and other areas where we need to have that early detection, rapid response. How do we know what to do where, and how do we know that we're in the right balance?
Yeah, that's for me, right, Jack?
Yeah.
Just making sure. Yeah, I mean,
go ahead.
I think that's the place where we got to bring all these tools together. So it's really exciting that with the NRCS and with SageCon, we have a framework and a map to try to think about what is your neighborhood. You know, every person on this call right now can find out the lands that they own, manage, or recreate on. What is its general condition, and what is the condition of the matrix of landscapes around you? And then we need to begin matching suites of tools to the right parts of the landscape where they make the most amount of sense. If you have lost most of your bunch grasses, you have just a very different reality of what is possible than if you are in a place that has really intact vegetation, but being infringed upon by threats on the borders. Directing opportunity to the right places, spending money where it's proactive and gives us a bang for the buck down the road, like preemptive herbicide treatments where they make sense, like restoration of native perennial bunch grasses, and like livestock management, so that you're promoting the springtime resiliency of your bunch grasses. They've got to be all of our job in all parts of the landscape if we're going to turn this around.
Thanks, Matt. And the third member of our panel is Mark Porter. Mark's with a weed management specialist with ODA in Northeastern Oregon. Mark, what would you add to this discussion?
It's hard to add after these two gentlemen. They are doing a great job, and I appreciate it. I think I would add, you know, I've been doing noxious weed control for 20 some years professionally, and we as a state have taken a little bit of a back seat because in listing these plants and doing management just because of the scale of the problem. So I think one of the things I want to say is what a wonderful thing it is to have this group gathered and kind of feel like reinforcements are coming to be able to ramp up. We need to ramp up by growing that core, by protecting it, but we have to build and revitalize the networks of people and relationship around our state that we can then react and communicate so that we're coordinated in our efforts. I think that's really key. I think that one of the things I've learned in trying to track these newer invaders is that the level of EDRR, the level of vigilance that we have to have for these plants, going out and doing surveys, repeating those surveys at intervals and covering tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of acres at a time. We have to use the maps that Megan and company are creating for us to inform our decisions, but they don't replace people on the ground, trained observers to identify and actively jump on and manage those plants. So I think those are huge. And the other one I think that we're going to have a lot of conversation over time is trying to decide, you know, when we talk about invasive annual grasses and management, trying to parse out how to manage those blends of annual grasses where we have cheatgrass over here and Medusa over there and a blend over here with Vetnata just arriving. That gets it a little complicated. In the end, it's kind of the same story, but really when we go out to do it, we're going to have to work hard at trying to figure out just how to put those packages together.
Thanks, Mark. And Jeremy, you had the slides up about showing the ambulance and then also the doctor's tools for prevention. How do you see it doing the balance in the future?
Yeah, thanks, Jack. You know, we like our diagrams at NRCS and cartoons. So it's really at the heart of it. It's a paradigm shift in how we're thinking about rangeland management. We've become complacent with cheatgrass because we assume it's everywhere. You know, the green map that Chad showed in his introductory presentation shows us the distribution is widespread. The maps that Megan show you now with new remote sensing technology tell us that distribution is not uniform across our landscape. Here in Oregon, vast areas are still relatively intact and uninvaded. They may have low levels of invasion, and those are the places that we all need to rally right now to manage, because as we're focused on fires and the cheatgrass loop elsewhere in the more degraded landscapes, we're reacting, we're trying to do our best, but the resiliency of these remaining landscapes is going down. And so shifting the balance to a proactive approach that targets these large cores should be empowering for the people that live in those places to say, hey, we still have a chance to do something different here. For those that happen to be living and working in places that have already transitioned, perhaps this is a bit of a wake-up call to say, hey, you know, our future outcomes might actually be different than what we thought. Why are we arguing over which species of grasses to seed or whether or not to do fuel breaks when everything around you has been invaded? And that is the new reality for your landscape. So this is the type of mentality I think we're hoping to get across the next couple of days.
Thanks, Jeremy. And Matt, there's been a question from Tony maybe the world has changed. And she writes, are there any non-native grasses that could also be used in a smaller property situation? Why are we trying to defend native grasses in an ecological system that's perhaps changed? Is Tony onto something, perhaps with using non-natives, albeit perennials? Matt?
Yeah, it's always good to pin the Nature Conservancy guy with the native question. But no, it's a great one. You know, and I'll say straight up that there are a number of non-native species that are excellent tools to be considered in certain contexts. Of course, crested wheatgrass, forage kochia, a number of other ones. I guess where my position is just to back up and say the things that Jeremy, Mark, and I have been touching on of, it's first important to know your neighborhood. Those tools are more valuable in certain places than others. There are downsides to every tool. The downside to non-native vegetation, we know, is a pretty well-documented loss in biodiversity from the insect community on up. And just in general, we are uncomfortable with monocultures of any kind. Usually when we introduce a monoculture, we get problems in other ways. So to the degree that we can favor native species, there's a lot of payoff, but there's also a lot of challenges. Trying to introduce a native seed mix to a highly degraded, low resiliency site that's in that managing risk category, it's hard for me to make a lot of sense of that. But on the flip side, introducing crested wheatgrass to a relatively intact vegetation higher up with better resiliency is surrendering things that I don't think we need to. So knowing your neighborhood and then looking at the suite of tools that make the most sense for you to cherish and improve your perennial vegetation. Those are the steps we have to consider. And each person has to do it in the context of where they live and work, which is going to be different for all of us.
Thanks, Matt. And Mark, Megan wanted to know, post-disturbance, do you have any specific recommendations for management actions that will help guard against invasive establishment?
Yeah, in general, certainly. I think that the first thing to do is really to check and see if your condition, you know, as soon as you can, is what you thought it was. Is the presence of invasive annual grasses increased since last you looked? Did you not know you had them? I think they creep around a lot more than we give them credit for. So to look and be ready to treat and when you're in the context of a good condition landscape, to be ready to treat is important. I also think managing the disturbance, the second disturbance following, you've now stressed your plant community out with a fire with that disturbance level. If you come back in and with a spring graze or, you know, whatever that disturbance level is that comes in again, that's going to be probably a detrimental thing. So being really aware of the long-term progression of that plant community and giving it a chance to recover is important.
Thanks. Jeremy, would you like to touch on those two topics, non-natives and post-disturbance management to guard against invasive establishment?
Yeah, sure. You know, I've been around the Great Basin working on this for 20-something years. I grew up here, and I have watched us argue over issues like this since I started working in this field. I feel like finally now with data and geographic awareness, we can put the right practices in the right parts of the landscape, and they're not mutually exclusive. What I'm saying is that fuel breaks have a place in Oregon. Non-native species have a place in Oregon, just like Matt was saying. If I'm in a core area that's still supports high perennial plants, I'm going to be very skeptical about disturbing that soil to create a fuel break, interseeding introduced species when that just disturbs soils as well, oftentimes. So that's the mindset that this enables you to have, is really a more nuanced approach to addressing this problem.
Thanks, Jeremy. And Matt, a lot of articles recently have been talking about the importance of soil health. So in those core areas where you still have those intact ecosystems, what are things that you see graziers can do to protect or improve soil health and thereby the what should we say, the resilience of the perennial natives?
Yeah, no, it's a good question too. And some of the prep we had for this conversation, we were doing some comparing and contrasting of NRCS's, well done, tried and true ideas of principles for soil health, and how would those be the same or different for principles of invasive annual grass management? And to some degree, they're kind of the same thing, and it's two of them that are really important aren't you got to keep your soil covered and you got to promote your perennial vegetation. When it comes to the perspective of grazing, I think there is a lot of opportunities there for us. Me personally, and from the organization I work with, I would like to see a greater emphasis on the conversation around flexible grazing accommodation. I think there is a space for targeted grazing, turning out numbers of animals to try to bring down fuel loads. But I think that is a smaller tool with a smaller footprint of context than the amount of landscape use grazing that we have that could be better adjusted so that your producers are still meeting the forage needs they have to support their herds, support a business, support lifestyles in rural communities, while also making sure that the bunch grasses in the pastures they're utilizing have as much chance as possible to grow a full season of growth, reproduce seed, and put on the amount of vigor they need to withstand invasive annual grasses, which will be creeping in continuously in most of our places. How we actually do that, how we adjust the timing, duration, intensity of grazing to get both the bang for our buck of forage and perennial grass vigor, it's super hard. I won't go and say that it's an easy thing, but there's some exciting projects out there that are testing just this premise. Many BLM field offices are extremely interested in meeting more than halfway producers in this topic, but we're gonna need a lot more support. We're gonna need funding, and we're gonna need the case studies to build that trust, to show that this is possible, that flexibility is not a byword for just do whatever you want. It's a way to adjust grazing in a smart way that gets us a reward that is beneficial to all of us. And I guess I should say, TNC is really invested in this concept in multiple states. So this is close to our organizational fiber right now, trying to get this win-win for people in nature.
Great answer, thanks. And Mark, as a former or as a once maybe continuing weed control specialist, can we spray our way to success? And by that, I'm really saying is how much do we have to depend on technology versus our ecological knowledge?
That's a great question. No, we cannot spray our way to success, especially if that's all we do. One of the things I'd made a note that I wanted to say somewhere was just the idea that we have to use every tool in our toolbox. That's prescriptive grazing and grazing flexibility, that's seeding with native and non, that's hopefully supporting research that looks into effective biocontrol, both classical and non, maybe with the idea of weed suppressive bacteria, though that hasn't proved out yet, but there's maybe some merit to keep looking at that in our research. I think that we have to also do the hard work of prevention. We have very little real prevention measures in place. Weed-free forage, weed-free gravel kind of certifications. And I think we're also going to have to maybe look hard at subsidizing some of the better management we want to see. I know that might be a controversial way to say it, but we're going to have to help people do the extra work that it's going to take to be better managers, I think, at least initially anyway.
Okay, thanks. We're just about out of time. I'd like to hear a final thought from each of the three of you. So let's begin with Jeremy, then go to Matt, and then to Mark. Jeremy, what are the key takeaways you want people to take home with them at the end of this panel?
Where you live and work matters, and the things that are going around you matter. It's one of the first principles of ecology, and scale, and things are playing out in multiple different scales. I would also leave you with this. This isn't just a fire problem. We're going to talk a lot about wildfire prevention and suppression, but in our core areas, In fact, the remote sensing data have shown us that annuals are spreading irregardless of fire. They're filling in gaps between bunch grasses, outcompeting our seedlings, as Chad mentioned. And so we have to have this dual mindset of not only mitigating the fire risk that absolutely comes after cheatgrass is here, but if you're in a core, what can we do to manage that seed bank and manage those seed sources? This is not an impossible task. This is a puny little annual grass whose seed stays viable for 3 to 5 years. It's a big foe, but we can and we have to start thinking about reducing that seed bank proactively in those core landscapes.
Thanks, Jeremy. Matt, you're next, but I'd first like you to answer a question from Harry. Quick, he'd like to know, in a native system without cheatgrass, how often do much grasses successfully germinate and establish from seed?
Sure. It varies, obviously, by where you are and what species you're talking about, but in an effort to not give you a non-answer, I think you can generally say that about once every 10 years on average, we would expect a plant like blue bunch wheatgrass to successfully produce viable seed that has a chance to germinate in the spring. Couldn't cite you the papers that that's based on, and Chad Boyd is always here to tell me where I stray, but I think that's a general rule of thumb. Once a decade, we would think our native perennial bunch grasses would have the conditions they need to succeed.
And in 15 seconds, your final thoughts.
My final thoughts is, no matter where you are, you should be thinking about how the actions that you perform on the landscape affect invasive annual grasses as kind of your guiding North Star. We talk a lot about fire, and in low resiliency sites like Jeremy mentioned, it's just as true in more productive and more intact. In fact, in many ways, more important, since it's a lot easier to break these systems and fix them.
Thanks. And Mark, same question to you, 15 seconds, final thoughts.
I guess I think twofold. One is, nothing makes me happier than walking around in good perennial native bunch grass with lots of diversity in the plant community. That's a value that isn't only emotional, but I think it's also very real, that is something we need to keep to learn from. But I think the way we do it is that we realize that our management of this is a people problem, that it's the relationships we have and will work in and create that are going to help us do this job ahead of us. And I think when we talk about looking at the maps and they're all red and nasty looking, we got to remember that it's rare, at least, that that these things are everywhere. I like to say it's never everywhere, because you get that immediate, and it's a downer. So I want to say that it's never everywhere, and we just need to keep that in mind.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Jeremy. You've been a great way to start off this series of panels. And with that, we're going to go right into our next panel, Breaking the Fire Cycle. And our first presenter is Casey O'Connor, who's going to talk about the difference between direct and indirect suppression efforts for fire prevention. Casey, I'd like to turn it over to you.
All right, Jack, let me share my screen here.
Okay. And while you're doing that, I'd like to say that there's questions that didn't get answered, and I'm sure that Ben and his team at High Desert Partnership are going to get those questions to the people that were presenting last and get them back out to you with answers. So don't feel like they're going to be ignored. And with that, Casey, you're coming up. We're seeing your screen.
All right, can you see the presentation now, Jack?
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll dive into it. Yeah, my name's Casey O'Connor. I'm the fire planner for Burns Interagency Fire Zone here based out of Burns. And I'm going to start with some Fire 101. We'll start with fire anatomy. And this is basically, I'm seeing this, how we define a fire. Looking at the heel would be the back end. The wind would be traditionally blowing from this side and the head of the fire. And then a homogeneous fuel bed that you're going to have higher fire behavior on the downwind side, which we call the head, and the lowest end would be on the heel. And in between that range would be on your flanks of a fire. And then it propagates through preheating and burning through that fuel bed, but also spotting is another propagation method for fire. So going on, fire conditions drive tactics. And let's see, so looking at these two slides here, you can see drastically different fire behaviors going on. And we've got, you know, pretty benign behavior going around this, and this is burning out ahead of a larger fire at well, it's an old lookout out of Paisley, over Paisley, Oregon. And this is on that same fire in a much more energy loaded fuel bed of lodgepole, predominantly lodgepole pine. And so you can tell tactics would be different between those two fuel beds. And so the broad tactics I'm going to go over here are direct versus indirect. And so direct is what it, you know, the name implies. It's going right on the fire edge and suppressing it. And this is what we'd call mobile attacking through, and this looks like an annual fuel bed there. This one here is burning out off a road. And you can see the main fire is coming from this side. And it's creating a break in fuel by using a burnout as an indirect tactic. So there's sub-tactics within the direct, indirect categories here. Here's some happy firefighters. One's not wearing her helmet. It's not safe. But this is a single tree up off the backside of the Steens. I think that's Man Lake you're looking at down in the background. So that's in my little sandbox. And then here's indirect. This is a burning out off of older a fuel break that was established, I think 10 years before this fire. But this is the Watson Creek fire out of Paisley, Oregon, a couple years ago. And more examples of direct. It's right on the fire edge using retardant to suppress fire versus a burnout. And this was a wildfire we had last spring out in the Malheur Refuge. And this is burning off an existing control feature, a road. And more examples. You can see the red lines here. This is a fire, one of many out of Juntura area, predominantly, you know, that's kind of the expanding edge of invasive annual grassland. And here's an indirect. This is Eagle Creek fire. Some of you probably heard of this one. That's the Columbia River. And this is a burnout. This is the main fire, burnout coming off the interstate. And then this is a burnout at some communities that were right above, I'm trying to think of the name of this little Cascade Locks. So another indirect example. So the variables that drive the tactics: fire behavior, current and anticipated, your fuels, which is what I'm going to kind of dive into here, weather, topography, and those three factors there constitute the fire behavior triangle. Time, as the fire keeps burning, you know, people discuss options. Your options change. So you know, in my world, when we're on a fire, time is very valuable and decisions need to be timely. Available resources. What do you have to, you know, to use to suppress a fire, and how many, what type, agency versus non-agency, known, trusted. I mean, these are all big factors that go into my mind. Aircraft, that's one that's, it comes and then it goes. You know, it's all based on priorities within a bigger sandbox than the local district. Values, and you know, this is the broad breakout we do is, you know, primaries, life, property, and then we start talking resource values like sage grouse and lots of others in that realm. So indirect tactics can be used to bring the firefight to winnable ground, and fuel breaks are you know, they can, man-made is the ones I'm going to be talking about, but there's natural existing fuel breaks too, like rivers and lake beds and so forth. So this picture here, you can see this one here, that is right here. If you can see my cursor on this map, that picture was taken from this junction. And this is an example of you can see in Google Earth here, there's a fuel break that was in place. And this is the one out of that Watson Creek fire. And that is where the fire edge ended up ending on that. It's a different environment than we're talking about today with invasive annual stuff, but same concept in the fire suppression mindset. So I think the title on the agenda I saw was fire breaks, but I'm talking more fuel breaks, but fuel breaks do equal fire breaks. So I'm gonna go into some examples of what a fuel break is. So here's a good one. This is the West Coast, nice sandy beach. That's a pretty good fuel break. Here's a fuel break out of, this is in Georgia, I believe, in break, Georgia, Florida. This is West Mims off the Okefenokee Swamp in agroforestry country. A field break provides a safe location for firefighters to engage of. That's the main principle. It gives a spot where we can engage on a fire, and it gives us force multiplier. It's implied up there is we can do a lot more with less if we do have a field break. When we go out on large fires, that's the first thing we're looking for is a spot to make a stand at, a spot where we can suppress or use indirect or direct tactics from. This is an example of a field break in between Burns and Lakeview BLM out by the Coyote fire we had a couple years ago, and some modeling examples of how this field break was utilized. And then an after picture here, we did a little write-up on it. And you can see, and this was an older field break, but it was crucial to holding this fire to the size it ended in. Field breaks are the best chance on a bad day. Here's an example of I'd call a natural field break. It's not completely broken in field, but this is a combination of annual weed control that was used for Medusa head, and this is off the backside of the Steens. This was this last summer, the Needles Hill fire. And a combination of that and grazing made this edge of this fire, it kept it from crossing a major road. So this graph here, I stole out of a paper, Moriarty et al. 2015 that they've put out, and it shows what a fuel break does. Flame length is the measurement they're looking at here with fire behavior, and it's pulling, like a shrub 5 down to a shrub 2, and your flame lengths go down. And how that ties in, and this is what on the fire suppression side we call hauling chart. And these little symbols here show what your options are, how bad fire gets. And this is direct tactics for sure. Start getting dozers, it's a little higher fire behavior. And then it goes all the way out to the far end of a big fire day, and then flame lengths are shown in here. So in that last one, that's what a field break does, is it gives you a spot that you can engage safely. And then to close out and lead into where we're going here, and this is my little twist here on the Swiss cheese concept. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but it's lining up of, for, in this case, a big fire day. There's things that line up. Of course, you have to have an ignition to start off with. And then back to my fire triangle, fire behavior triangle, your topography, climate, weather. And then what can we influence within this? And then there's all these other factors that come to mind. And there's more than what I got there. And the big thing that we do have influence over, weather is what it is, topography is what it is the fuel bed. And what can we do to prevent these large mega fires? And this is something we've been discussing several years here in our large fire collaborative that I think some of you made plugs for already. And that's the end of my presentation, Jack. I guess I need to end my slideshow unless there's any go backs. I think you're on mute, or my audio's not coming. I'm not hearing anything there.
Jack, your audio is not coming through.
Okay,
Ben,
sorry for the interruption.
there we go.
Now we'd like to hear from Jacob Gear. He's the Rangeland Fire Protection Liaison in Burns. Jacob, what would you add?
Yeah, good afternoon. No, I think Casey really hit it nail on the head. It gives us an opportunity to take advantage and fight the fire where we know we can do it safely. And, he showed the chart, and you're talking the difference between a 20-foot flame light coming at you at the head versus a a 5 foot or 10 foot, you know, I'd take my chances with the 5 and 10 foot climb lengths. And so, you know, for myself and the RFPAs, you know, we're definitely a big fan of the fuel breaks. It just allows us opportunities to fight fire safely.
And Jacob, what's the difference between an RFPA and then the conventional agency interactions that occur in Harney County, Southeast Oregon, probably throughout the West?
Yeah, you know, so Burns is kind of unique, or Harney County is, as you mentioned, Jack. I'm the Rangeland Fire Protection Association liaison, and we're the only one that has a specific liaison just for our county, and that came through the Wildfire Collaborative. And what's neat about that is that gives us an opportunity to work more closely with our RFPAs and really focus on our relationships and just have a one-on-one relationship, especially if the outside incident management team or something comes in. You know, part of my role is to work with that team and facilitate some of those conversations.
So, Jacob, Harney County is still full of gravel roads. You still travel around in pickups and 1-ton trucks. How has your ability to respond quickly changed with the same technology you had 20 years ago?
Yeah, you know, some of the changes we've seen is, you know, that, well, detection, we'll talk a little bit more. I think Casey will cover some of that too. But, you know, we've got a detection camera system that we've been working on here in Harney County and through Eastern Oregon. And we're going to continue to build on that infrastructure and look for opportunities to bring utilities and other partners in. Having early detection allows us to send the right response to an incident right when it starts, so that we're not waiting for resources to arrive on scene and needing more, and also allocate the resources on a multiple fire start day to the right incidents.
And Casey, how would you say that the RFPAs, the Rural Fire Protection Associations, are interacting with the agencies, and how has this improved early detection? And Casey, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah, no, the RFPAs have come a long way since I've been here, and I started out, you know, right out of high school in '98, and there was players down south, but since the last, you know, 5 years, RFPAs have come a long ways, and they're the ones that call in a lot of the fires. They give us size ups, and they have equipment parked out at their ranches. So there's oftentimes the fire's dealt with before we even get agency trucks down there. So they're huge.
So it sounds like this is a kind of a newly developing technology. You're with the use of cameras and radar. What do you see down the road that will improve the early response to fires? And let's go with Jacob and then Casey.
Yeah, so, you know, it's in the past, we strictly relied on people calling in and, you know, we mentioned the detection cameras. The nice thing is we get a lightning storm or something like that, we can pull those cameras up and we can look across the landscape and hopefully detect those smokes before they get bigger. And we're not relying on somebody to see them, then find their way to self-service to call those in.
And Casey, what would you add?
Yeah, technology is continually evolving. The detection cameras are one piece of that. There's also real-time spatial stuff we utilize like VIIRS and MODIS, and then the GOES satellites. And the detection cameras, you know, like just this past summer, we utilized them to confirm some ignitions, and it also helps us right-size the response to those fires because you can, you know, get a visual depiction of what's going on. So it's continually evolving, and I think as we get a better network with the detection cameras, we will utilize it. It's a good tool.
Tell us a little bit about coordination. Megan mentioned that in her initial talk about the collaboration is one of the 4 key elements. What kind of collaboration, coordination goes on between you two and the agencies and the private landowners you represent? Casey and then Jacob.
Yeah, coordination. I think when I was talking about, you know, what resources you have for a fire. One of those pieces is known and trusted resources, and that's within the agency. You know, you have certain people you'd ask to do certain things, and that trust wasn't always there with the RFPAs, but it's come a long ways, and now you do have that trust in the, you know, from the coordinated work of, you know, Jacob putting on trainings in the spring, and just people building trust with one another, especially when, you know, in our world, it's a very real deal when you're trusting somebody to be, you know, covering your back end on a fire, because it could leave you hanging. But it's come a long ways with our RFPA group. I think both ways, for us trusting them and respecting what they can do, as well as, you know, I'm on a limb there, but I think they trust us a lot more as well. So it's come a long ways.
Jacob, what would you add?
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. It's a trust factor, and especially when things are going bad. You know, one of the biggest things we've done is on the agency side and with the RFPs is we've found that just taking a moment and getting to know each other, not talk about the fire, but just get to know each other on a personal basis. You start to build that trust. And so that we realize that we're all out here trying to do the exact same thing. We're trying to do the right thing, and we're trying to put the fire out. We all have different experiences, you know, and I wish there was some of the RFPs were on this, but you know, my experiences with fire differ from their experiences with fire, and what actions we think we need to take. But having trust and working together, we've realized that, you know, we can talk about what it is, and they trust me when I say, or Casey says, or one of our guys says, this is what we need to do, and this is why, that we're doing the right thing for the right reasons. And that buys us a lot, having that relationship.
Okay, thanks. Casey, you gave us a pretty good introduction to fuel breaks. Some of the fuel breaks we saw are simply bare ground. If I was a cheatgrass seed or a Medusa seed, I'd be licking my lips in anticipation to get to your fuel break. Is there such a thing as a fuel break in Harney County that is vegetated?
Yeah, I don't want to poke the bear here looking at the chat board, but I won't talk about green strips. But there are vegetated fuel breaks that I've seen. In the past, when I started out, crested wheat seedings were one such thing. Another one that's more natural that won't upset people so much is aspen stands. Have also served as a holding feature, just from the elevated fuel moisture within them. And then there's riparian zones. There's examples of riparian zones. If you got, you know, riparian vegetation that could be utilized for a vegetated fuel break. And once again, that's the fuel moisture piece kicking in there. And one last plug on the fuel breaks, you know, when they're talking the proactive versus reactive with weed management, that's how I look at fuel breaks is, you know, we've been very reactive in the fire world. We send more, you know, super heavies, VLATs, more of this, more of that. But if we want to get proactive, fuel breaks are the key I see to stopping the mega fires that we've seen here. And they are burning through areas that we used to think wouldn't burn, like Miller Homestead and Holloway Fire are such places that low fire history, but they came to life.
And Jacob, what would you add about fuel breaks?
You know, I mentioned flame lengths and stuff, and Casey mentioned it earlier, but the biggest thing about fuel breaks is, you know, we had a fire this summer, Neils Hill, and we put in a couple miles of fire line with one dozer and a couple drip torches and one engine. If we tried to go direct on that same piece of line, we never would have held it. And so, yeah, sometimes you add a little bit of acres by going indirect, falling back to that fuel break, but a lot of times you save a lot more doing it. And it's knowing when to make a decision.
You pose fuel breaks in the Bare Ground Association as maybe a necessary evil, but it sounds like something we need to work on in the future. Joshua is concerned about the possible permanent damage that a fuel break might create. Any thoughts on that, Jacob and then Casey?
Yeah, you know, I'm not a biologist or anything like that. I'm a firefighter, and so I can speak from a firefighting standpoint. You know, if sometimes taking a little by putting in a fuel break and having to maintain that is better than losing a lot more acres in the long term.
Okay, and Casey, what would you add?
Yeah, I think it's known. It is a bit of a sacrifice on the landscape, but I mean, that's the environment we live in. And I guess I'm looking through a different lens than a lot of people are that are, have different values on it. But I see it as keeping a fire to a couple thousand acres versus, hundreds of thousand acres like we've seen, which is a much bigger disturbance than what I see on a fuel break. So yeah, and I think if we do fuel breaks ahead of time, it's going to be there'll be a lot better collaborative discussion in how we implement them versus if you wait for that large fire, you're going to get you're going to get a large fire team come in and it's going to be a dirty fuel break. They will put one in, but it'll be an emergency action rather than a planned collaborative action.
Okay. Craig has asked, why not make a fuel break permanent by sowing back in the local ecotypes of native bunch grasses? Casey, could you answer that question?
Yeah, if it would work. I guess I haven't seen, that goes back to what, Chad and Mark Owens were talking about, how competitive annual grasses are. If we could do that, I think certain locations it would work with certain native bunch grasses. Other locations where you're dealing with the invasive grass issue, I don't know that that's an option. I think you have to, that would solve the problem they're saying is difficult. So if it's in the right site, yes.
And Matt Cahill, if you're still available, as I know from the last panel discussion, you have a sense of the ecology of southeastern Oregon. Would you like to weigh in? And you're on mute. There you are, Matt, if you'd unmute.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, you catch me a little bit.
Is a fuel break, bare ground of a fuel break, a necessary evil, or have you thought about this?
Yeah, actually, TNC has put a lot of thought into fuel breaks, and it might not surprise you to hear that our general position is it's a tool in the toolbox, and it's valuable in the right places. I think the places we often advocate for is making sure that we put as much thought as possible into where these fuel breaks get established. Thinking through the criteria that make them the most useful in terms of, all right, do they have adequate access to places that firefighters are going to be responding from? Do they make sense given our understanding of typical wind patterns and where fires tend to move across the landscape? What happens behind the fuel break? Are we putting them in places where we think either the most important stuff is going to be protected, or potentially where really good bunchgrass communities, for example, might slow the spread of the fire and recover faster after it moves through? So yeah, bare patches on the landscape, they're going to be part of our reality. We all know that the BLM has a lot on its plate, and it's really challenging for them to upkeep fuel breaks as much as they need to. So also thinking, what are the upkeep costs going into the future if an herbicide control is going to be part of keeping 2 years from now us having a cheatgrass strip where a fuel break got put in? So a lot to go into it, a lot of thought that needs to get applied. Absolutely, they need to be in certain places. They're part of our solution, but we can do them. You can do them smarter and less smart, and we're just advocating for as smart as we can be.
Thanks, Matt. And Casey, Michelle would like to know. She says we probably can't afford to put fuel breaks everywhere. How do you prioritize the best places to put a fuel break, Casey?
Yeah, and we're struggling, or not struggling, but we're looking into that here locally now through a subcommittee groups and through our large fire collaborative, trying to figure out what the right size is, what is sustainable. Like Matt was talking about, upkeep is an issue, and the firefighter, I'd like fuel breaks all over the place because it'll make my job easier, but that's not reality, and there's got to be a compromise. And we're trying to retool the pods concept that's been used pretty heavily within this region, the Oregon Washington region, and looking at what the right size is on that. And I think it's tied to the fire danger within that landscape and a whole lot of other collaborative type value, figuring out from all the ologist perspective, how much they're willing to subject to fuel breaks. But we do know off of roads where there's good access is a good starting point.
Thanks, Casey. Jacob, anything you want to add before we go to final thoughts on fuel breaks?
No, you guys covered it well. It's picking the right places where we're going to make a stand anyway. So it's looking at your topography. It's looking at past fires, what they've done, and being smart about where we're putting them on the landscape.
Okay, so let's go to final thoughts then. Jacob, what do you want people to take away from this session? And then Casey. Jacob?
Yeah, really for me, it's the biggest thing is we're all having this discussion about annual grasses is, I go back to firefighter and public safety and what can we do to maximize our chances while we're making a stand. And so just keep an open mind and think through creative solutions.
And Casey, what are your final thoughts?
Yeah, being more proactive, I guess. And I feel like we've been talking fuel breaks, green strips, and that stuff. And I feel a lot of people feel like it's some conspiracy that we're running, but it is what works. And some of those examples I showed you, that ranges all the way across the whole country. That's what the fire group utilizes to deal with big fires. And if we can have fuel breaks on the landscape ahead of time, we're a lot more proactive. That cuts down on wasted time, and that reduces that large fire issue significantly. So it's trying to take a more proactive approach and make a change rather than, I think Megan pitched something like 3 million acres in Oregon in the last 20 years on some of the data. That's a lot of disturbance there.
Thanks, Casey. Thanks, Jacob, for telling us about fuel breaks and how the Rural Fire Protection Associations are working with agencies. It's a great presentation. With that, we'll go to Ben or Brad to lead us into the break.
Sure, thanks, Jack. Great conversation. And we just thought that we wouldn't be doing annual grass management justice if we didn't talk a little bit about fire, since that's generally how it gets established. So with that, we're entering our 20-minute break, but before we do that, I'll do our first random draw for our prizes, which we'll start off with the buck knife, a nice 3930 Rejuvra hat, and then Wildfire Collaborative sticker. So just hit the number here. Looks like it is Jared Huddleston, sorry, got that name wrong. Jared Huddleston, all right. And looks like he is on. So Jared, I'll send you a chat and get your address from you to send you some free stuff. And now I'll start our Wildfire Collaborative video. So the Harney County Wildfire Collaborative, just a group of partners, a diverse group of folks here that are trying to mitigate the effects of wildfire through a bunch of different actions that are described in the video. So I guess I'll just let it speak for itself, and we'll ask you to join us back here at 2:40.
We're going to shift gears a little bit. First part, we're talking a little bit about the reactive part of catching fires early. And now we're going to talk about reducing wildfire risk in the first place. And to start us off, Kirk Davies will be giving us a presentation. Kirk is the lead range scientist for the ARS at Burns. And Kirk, I'd turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jack. Let's see if I can get my screen shared here. All right. I think we got the right screen share. I'm looking at two screens and it seems like the right one sharing, so hopefully that's the case. So I'm going to talk about grazing to decrease wildfire probability. As Jack said, I'm with the USDA Agriculture Research Service, and that's at the Eastern Oregon Ag Research Center here in Burns, Oregon. So why grazing? We often, think of grazing as being just a a use of the land, not necessarily a tool to do something. What it comes down to, though, is almost all of our big fire years are tied to 1 or 2 years of above average vegetation production. What that really boils down to is we have a couple wet years, and then we're followed by a dry year. And we have this buildup of fuel, and most of it's fine fuel that fuels these big fire years. These rangelands are expansive, and so it really has to be a landscape level treatment to have any effect. And grazing is really the only treatment that's feasible at these landscapes that we need to treat. But it's not without challenges. So I'm going to go into a little bit to start with just what grazing can do to fuels, lead it into the fire, and then end with kind of where we need to go from there. So this is grazing in a native community. And what you see here is fuel biomass. It's in kilograms per hectare, which is pretty much equivalent to pounds per acre. And we have a grazed area and a non-grazed area. And what you see is standing crop, that STC, that's the vegetation that's still erect from this year and prior years. And you see that we have about double the amount of fuels out there from an area being not grazed. So grazing's reduced that fuels by more than half. And we see other things aren't nearly as affected, like the herbaceous layer, which is the current living stuff, and litter, not nearly affected by grazing. But the overall total amount of fine fuel standing there is a lot more. Now, of course, total amount of fuel is a big deal, but another big deal in terms of fire is the continuity of the fuel. And so this is a look at grazing's effect on the continuity of fuel, as well as its ability to help increase the size of fuel gaps. And we see if we just look at the perennial bunchgrass component, that it's reducing that continuity of fine fuels by quite a bit. Now, if we look at the fuel gap, we see it's much larger in the grazed area. And the advantage of that is that the larger the fuel gap is, the longer it takes fire to spread across the landscape. But also it runs into periods of time when it won't burn across that landscape because the fuel gaps are too big and the wind speeds aren't high enough. So it helps maintain in the ability of the plant community to not be burned, as well as create mosaic burn patterns. This is just kind of give you an idea of what difference you'd be seeing if you looked at a community that was grazed versus not grazed. And what you see is there's just a buildup of dead fuels on top of ungrazed perennial bunch grasses. It increases the fuel depth, but also the total area continuity of fuels, as you can see between those. The yearly production in one of these plants is essentially the same, unless it's grazed in that year too. Now, of course, a lot of the interest is in grazing these exotic annual grass invaded rangelands, trying to break that annual grass fire cycle. This is a study we did in northern Nevada in the Boulder Valley, and we applied dormant season grazing in this study. And the reason we were looking at dormant season grazing is because we generally don't exactly know how much fuel we're going to have in the growing season, because any new rain, we get more production from our annual grasses. There's also a limited number of cattle available, and so if we can extend that grazing season out into the fall, we can graze areas that would not been grazed heavy enough in the past. What we end up doing with this is we end up using supplements to try to get these cows across this landscape. And we really found that they'll travel, of course, a lot further during these dormant seasons. So a lot of times we're tied to water in the growing season in the summer with any kind of fuel treatments. But as we get into the cooler dormant season, the fall and the winter, cattle will travel a lot further from water. So in this study, this is just showing the reduction in fuels in that area over time in 4 different areas. Area 1 is at 1 kilometer from water, whereas you get to area 4, it's 4 kilometers from water. We would have liked to have done a lot further distances, but that was as long as the pasture was from water that we could get. What we saw is that right away that we could get cows to go 4 kilometers from water in the dormant season. Now, we generally think of cattle usually traveling about 2 kilometers in the summer, so we could essentially double that area, and they would have went further, but we didn't have a larger area to do. And what we see is with the supplement stuff that we could reduce the exotic annual fuels fairly rapidly in the first kilometer from water. But by the end of 4 weeks, we could get them to graze all the way out to 4 kilometers from water and reduce those fuels to below the point that they'd really be a risk. So that's, going from 400 to 600 pounds per acre to down around 100 or less pounds per acre. Very different likelihood of burning. Another really interesting effect of grazing is the effect on fuel moisture. So this red line here, the fuel moisture extinction, essentially anything below that line will readily burn. We're looking at an area that was ungrazed and an area that was winter grazed prior to the fire season. What we see is that the ungrazed area was ready, dry enough essentially to burn in early July, whereas the winter grazed area really wasn't dry enough to burn until the end of August. And even then it had a much higher fuel moisture content, meaning that it was less likely to burn and fire would be a lot less likely to carry very fast through that community. So the grazing, besides influencing amounts and continuity of fuel, it's actually influencing the fuel moisture content by removing a lot of that dead fuel from prior years. This is another study looking at fuel moisture content. And this is at different time of grazing. So we had a fall grazed, which is the black, a spring grazed, which is gray, and then an ungrazed area, which was the kind of dark gray. And what we saw in July is that the ungrazed area was dry enough to readily burn. So it's below that fuel moisture extinction line, kind of right at it, but below it a little bit. Whereas the other two areas were almost twice, or they had almost twice as much fuel moisture content. So they really weren't ready to burn. We go to August, the fall graze and spring graze are now approaching that fuel moisture extinction line where they probably would burn, but take the right conditions. Whereas the ungrazed area is really low fuel moisture content and would readily burn. So very different effect by whether grazed or not grazed. We see that it can be either fall or spring grazed and still get that same outcome. This is a picture from the Buzzard fire, where we applied winter grazing the year after the fire, and then an area, of course, that we excluded grazing. And what you see here is that effect. There's a vastly less fuel in the winter grazed area, and a lot of the fuel that's in the non-grazed area is the buildup of prior year's growth. And in this case, a lot of it's cheatgrass fuels, whereas it's been reduced in this other area. And this is taken in June. And you look at that ungrazed area and you can see that a fire would readily carry through that if that was across the landscape. Really just kind of highlighting the effect of grazing on fuels and the likelihood of it being burnable. Now we've talked quite a bit about fuel effect or grazing's effects on fuels. How does that translate into wildfire risk? So we did several studies looking at just that. So if we're going to have a wildfire, we have to have ignition source. That's, your lightning, a campfire gets away, someone throws a cigarette out. It has to hit fuel that it can light. So it has to ignite fuel and start a fire. And then for that to become a wildfire, it has to spread from that initial fuel that starts to more fuel. So we looked at fall grazing, spring grazing, and ungrazed, and at two different times, July and August, with each one of these with 20 different ignition attempts at 5 different sites. So this is ignition probability. So this is the likelihood that that ignition source is going to actually light something on fire. It's not hitting bare ground, it's hitting fuel, and that fuel is dry enough to light. So this is as a probability. So if it lit every time that every ignition lit and started a fire, it would be 100%. Of course, 0% means nothing ever burned. What we see is that the fall graze and the spring grazing greatly decreased the probability compared to the ungrazed area of that fire in July igniting. So we see that's about half as likely to ignite fire if it was fall or spring grazed compared to ungrazed. We see as we go to August that all of them become more likely to burn because they're drying out more, but you still see that same pattern holds true, that spring grazed and fall grazed areas are about half as likely to have that ignition source actually light fuel on fire. And this is just moderate levels of grazing, 40, 50% use. It's not excessively heavy grazing. So if you get that initial piece of fuel burning, to have that fire, it has to spread to more fuel. And so this is looking at that. So once a piece of fuel is on fire, will it spread to more fuel? And we see in July, that's pretty unlikely in the spring grazed and ungrazed areas, less than 20% of the time. Whereas it was almost 70% of the time in the ungrazed area that ignition source would result in that fire spreading. Now we get to August and we do see that at that point that fall grazing and spring grazing are having different effects, that spring grazing is much more effective still at reducing that likelihood of fire spread because it removes some of the current year's growth. Whereas fall grazing didn't remove any of the current year's growth, just the prior year's growth. It's much more likely to have fire spread in August, but it's still significantly less than the ungrazed area. So the probability of burning is a lot less. So when and where? As I mentioned before, most of our big fire years occur after a year or two of above average production. So we don't need to apply this, more grazing like every year in every location. Probably the most likely scenario is we're going to extend the grazing season. One, because it has low impact, so it's a lot less likely to have negative effects by increasing grazing. Cattle also travel a lot further in the cooler months of the winter and fall. The other effect, of course, is that the cattle need to be available. So generally, most cows are allocated somewhere during the growing season. And so we could extend the grazing season. Now, with that in mind, we have to be cognizant that some areas have too much snow and stuff. So the risk there is we wouldn't want to go there. And of course, the community needs to be a herbaceous. The herbaceous component needs to be a significant fuel source. Now, almost all of our plant communities, sagebrush plant communities in the Northern Great Basin have a significant herbaceous component that drives these fires. Not to say that shrubs aren't a main driver too, but the engagement of the shrubs can even be controlled to some degree by the herbaceous fuel. Now, it needs to be a flexible and strategic plan because we're not going to have the ability to do it everywhere we want to, and we don't want to do it everywhere because there's going to be areas that we want that residual vegetation for wildlife. And it also needs to be able to work within other people's constraints because it won't be something that just because we want to do it somewhere that we'll have the cattle available to do it. So an overall, a plan needs to be developed that maximizes the benefit we get out of this within what we can do. Some final considerations. This is real important. Grazing is not a binomial treatment. It's not just grazed or not grazed. And I know that my presentation kind of presented it that way, but all that grazing was either moderate grazed areas, 40–50% utilization. And I generally tells you what time of year we're using it. Improper grazing can decrease our native perennial bunch grasses and increase our exotic annuals, essentially causing exactly what we don't want to have, increasing the likelihood that these areas would burn. Whereas proper grazing, and proper grazing is generally, 40–50% utilization, some periods of rest or deferment. Improper grazing would be the opposite, repeated heavy use in the growing season. So we want to, balance this some strategy of reducing fire risk, but maintain our native perennial bunch grasses as well as meet the habitat needs for species that need residual vegetation left on that landscape. With that being said, I'm going to throw out a few questions for the other panel members. How do you transition from the science to on-the-ground management? And what are the challenges for public land managers to use grazing to manage fuels and subsequently fire? And then similarly, what are the challenges for ranchers, the permittees to do this? With that, I'll turn it back over to Jack.
Thanks, Kirk. And we'll go next to Bill Draught. He's the supervising natural resource specialist from the Burns BLM. Bill, and Kirk, leave up your questions if you would. And Bill, would you like to go next?
I will. Can I share my screen if Kirk is?
Yes, go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead, and Kirk will take his down. I'm sorry. And I see that there's questions coming up on chat, and we'll get to them in a few minutes. So please keep coming to those questions if you would.
So I'm going to give a specific example of a project that we have in the district, which is winter grazing of Medusa head. And I'm going to talk about 4 basic concepts. One of them is preventing reburning. Another one is thatch, which turns out to be a big deal when talking about Medusa head. The goal is to differentially stress the invasive annual grasses, and then a couple comments about how this works. So this is a picture looking across private land onto the area where—
Bill, I'm going to interrupt you for just a second. You're still in presenter view, and if you could give us a different view on your PowerPoint, that'd be great.
Gosh.
Bill, are you using 2 screens? Because if I share the wrong screen, that's what my audience would see.
Okay, I am.
You can also go up to the display settings at the top and either duplicate the view or switch it.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. So this is, again, this is a view of looking across a piece of private land towards the allotment where we're doing targeted grazing on Medusa head. All of this has burned. You can see here the lower part has burned a lot less intensely than either of the side hills. And the reason I always like to show this is these little white flowers out here. Can you guys see my cursor?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, these little white flowers are Malaheur princess bloom, one of our special status species. On BLM on the Burns District, we have thousands of acres of land that has burned once or twice or several times that has converted to invasive annual grasses with residual perennial plants. This is not the Pueblos. This is, we're already past protecting the core. So this is thatch, and it's all this gray stuff down here. And this is perennial winter buildup from Medusa head. And the importance of thatch, it has several concerns. First of all, this will carry a fire like crazy. Second, Medusa head seeds will germinate in the thatch, whereas, and cheatgrass can too. Desirable perennial bunch grasses need soil seed contact in order to germinate. So even in those 1 or 2 years out of 10, when we get a viable seed production from the desirable perennial bunch grasses, if they're in a situation like that, they're going to lay in the thatch and they won't be able to germinate at all. So the next few pictures are pictures of one of our monitoring sites in the winter grazing area. And this is just a landscape view. And this is by far our most difficult site. And you can see here, this is a fall picture. There's still a lot of Medusa on the ground. You can, if you look around, you can see a few perennial bunch grasses, but there aren't a lot. So this is the close-up. Once again, there's a huge amount of Medusa head. This was a good year for blue lettuce, and there's a few perennial bunch grasses scattered throughout here. But you can also tell that we do not have the thatch layer anymore. In the projects that we have done on Burns trying to do this, the cattle pretty successfully cleaned up the thatch layer in the first year of winter grazing. So this is the next spring. And what you see here now are the perennial bunch grasses that you couldn't see in the previous slide. but you see, there's still a lot of Medusa head seed heads here, but we're keeping up with the Medusa head litter. So, and then here's the July picture. So clearly this is not a one-year project. The permittee, when he started doing this, he was like, I have this field and I don't know what I'm gonna do with it. They are so happy with this winter grazing of Medusa head that they now view this as part of their annual forage resource. And you can see in here, there's still a little bit of perennial bunch grass. Here's a forb. There's a little bit of slack-tuca down in the understory, but the Medusa head is just, you know, the dominant thing. So because they are committed to do this, hopefully they will stick with it until there's a huge difference in the Medusa head. This is based on a project in central Nevada, and over the course of 4 or 5 years, they went from dominated by cheatgrass to dominated by crested wheatgrass, but still a lot of cheatgrass in the understory. And not to be discouraging, this is another one of our monitoring sites on a better site. And again, this is the July picture. And you can see there is very little Medusa head in the understory. Although a lot of this is crested because this all has burned at least once. There's like Basin wild rye, there's perennial forbs, there's a little squirrel tail over here. There is some blue bunch out in here. It's a much better, we're going in the right direction here. And as other people have brought up, you can see how the interspaces are not only relatively clear of invasive annual grasses, they are clear of, or they're will serve as a fire break. So how does this work? This doesn't work everywhere. There are specific places that are more adaptable to it. This allotment is right next to the permittee's ranch. So if the weather gets bad in the winter, they have access to their cows. Other places we've tried this, those people tend to be most likely to keep doing this for a number of years. Starting with fall rains, and then when you get frost, all this much finer plant material absorbs moisture faster than this coarser plant material of the perennial bunch grasses. When we're out here doing the monitoring in the fall, it's apparent that the cows are at that time seeking out the Medusa head. And one year, which had a warm, wet fall, the cows on this field gained body condition score during the period of use out here, which generally means they gained weight. So the cows readily take it, and it is not inherently detrimental to them. So that's my presentation. If anybody has any questions, feel free.
Okay, we'll get back to you with the questions. Let's move on to Katie Wolstein. Katie is a rangeland fire regional specialist with OSU Extension at Eastern Oregon Ag Research Center. Katie, what have you heard? What would you like to add?
Thanks, Jack. Hi, everyone. One thing I'd like to bring into this conversation is something Kirk alluded to on that last slide where he posed some questions for all of us here today. And my first thought is it's important to keep in mind that, especially in Eastern Oregon, but also throughout the Great Basin, ranchers are operating in a public and private lands context, right? So it's, this is good science that we're learning from Kirk and others here today. How do we transfer that on the ground in the real world, where a rancher can more or less do what he or she may like in terms of grazing management on their private land, but they also are more than likely grazing on public lands as well. And when that happens, they have to follow the rules that are put in place. And so the way that's done, at least for the Bureau of Land Management, as Bill was exemplifying for us, is through permit grazing administration. And so the challenges there are that often grazing permits, or at least as written in the policy, they're only renewed every 10 years. And that means if a permit needs to be adjusted to maybe a change in condition, or allotment condition has shifted to a new state following a fire, that permit has some lag time before it can be updated to reflect the new ecological condition on the land. And so if there's cheatgrass or medusa head invasion and that permit isn't updated, then the rancher can't adjust their grazing to effectively manage that new fire risk. And so, that's a challenge. And so there's been some conversations about how do you respond better to annual variation? As Kirk said, 1 or 2 years of increased moisture increases fire risk. And so how can you get cows out there or other kinds of livestock in a timely manner to actually adequately address fire risk? And so that's an ongoing conversation for sure that needs to be integrated into permit administration.
Thanks, Katie. And Casey, who is also on the previous panel, how do you see land management, like has been described previously, affecting wildfire response? Casey?
Yeah, I think land management, a lot of what we deal with fires in recent years is a relic of changes in land management practices, be that within the rangelands or in timbered environments. A lot of these mega fires, these big fire scenarios that we go out on teams with is a relic of shifts in management practices, be it overstocking of timber in the forest environment, changes in grazing practices, and then you get climate change and other factors involved with that. So yeah, land management is a big factor in the fire world.
Thanks, Casey. With that, Ben, I'd like you to lead us through the chat questions. I think you might be able to do it better and keep track. But if you could start with Christy Swartz, I think she had a question for Kirk, and just work on down. Ben, would you be willing to do that?
Sure. There's a number of really good questions in the chat. So I guess I think the one that Christy had was, what vegetation types were the fuel moistures sampled from in your study, Kirk, to determine their relationship to moisture of extinction?
So we did, those studies were over several different types of community types. We did native plant communities as well as exotic annual grass plant communities. And the relationship held true that grazing significantly reduced the fuel moisture content at the herbaceous level by removing large amounts of prior year's growth. So you're removing that dead fuel from the mix, and you're having more live fuel ratios.
All right, thanks. And then follow up to that, were your studies looking at cattle exclusively or other herbivores?
Yeah, so our studies were all using cattle since it's the predominant livestock grazer. I mean, there is sheep and a few goats here and there, but cattle is the one that's of any numbers that could actually significantly affect landscapes at the scale that we would be talking about using them for management.
Okay. I got one more for you, Kirk, and then we'll move on to someone else. How does grazing keep the moisture content of plants higher than ungrazed? Is it concentrating the available water into less biomass, or how does that work?
So I kind of just answered the last question, but it's really changing the ratio of dead to live. So you're removing a lot of the dead dry fuels, and then you're just left with the current year's growth, which is generally, even at the end of the growing season when it's not growing, still not as dry as prior year's growth.
Sure. All right, thanks for that. Let's see, I'll aim one at Bill. Has the project that you described documenting cattle grazing Medusa head and gaining body condition been published or referenced anywhere that people can look at?
No.
Okay.
However, this is a pilot project of a study by Barry Perriman at the University of Nevada, Reno. And I can give Ben a couple of citations for that. And there are publications on that. And so this is a pilot project. And the difference between this and the original research project is in Austin, invasive annual grass is predominantly cheatgrass. Here, it's a lot of Medusa head and it has intermixed cheatgrass.
Sure, and then one more follow-up question to that is, for examples that were winter grazing reducing thatch, is that due to direct herbivory or some other factor? Someone asked a question that they would assume cattle are not eating the thatch, but what's happening there?
You know, so I don't have the fecal analysis to prove this, but I would assume that that is correct. Because Medusa head and cheatgrass are winter annuals, they will grow up in the thatch, and the cows will take some of the thatch with the new green leaves. But I think a lot of it is walking around on top of it.
Thanks for that. So I'm not sure who to direct this one at, so I'll let you all choose, but this is sort of a tricky one. What tools might people use to determine where the line is between improper and proper grazing? So what are the best available tools with what we know now?
I'll take that question, Ben. So there's quite a bit of pretty good literature out there already establishing what proper and improper grazing are. Yes, there's probably a thin line between them at some point, but generally if you follow kind of the general established grazing, from your standard rate management, where you're looking at 40 to 50% utilization, you alternate, growing season use with non-growing season use. So you go to either later in the summer when they quit growing, or out into the fall, or even into the winter, and then you have some years of complete rest. That's generally your proper grazing. On the extreme end, we're having repeated heavy usage, where you're going above 60% utilization. You're repeatedly using them in the growing season with no rest, no deferment. And that's, you start shrinking the size of those perennial bunch grasses. They're not producing seeds to be available when the opportunity does come to reestablish in those plant communities. Now, if you're looking at tools for whether your grazing is proper or not, a lot of these, trend analysis, stuff like that, where you're looking at the density of these perennial bunch grasses, the size of these perennial bunch grasses over time is how you tell if your management is working or not working.
Thanks for that. This one specific to your research too, Kirk. Question was there a target utilization percentage in the dormant grazing for your study you referenced, going from 1 to 4 kilometers from water?
Yeah, so in that study, we were really just shooting to see if we could get it below 100 pounds per acre. And the reason we did that was there was some prior research showing that essentially cheatgrass fires wouldn't carry if you reduced fuels below that. So we're kind of looking at it almost as like an enormous fuel break, where we could reduce the fuels with dormant season grazing to below a certain amount. But that kind of target in annual grassland is pretty adjustable.
Sure. And then I got one more question, can be for all of you or any of you who've done the winter grazing. How has the soil responded to winter grazing?
Well, I guess I'll take a first stab at it. With the stuff we've done, there's been no real native soil effects. We've generally seen that, yes, if you had an annual grassland, you continually reduced it to a point where there wasn't any litter left, you might have some erosion risk. But generally, there's still roots in the soil, and by the next spring, or even that early winter or late winter, sorry, you start having that new growth of annual grasses. So they're holding that soil in place still.
So on our project, we have two pretty distinctive soil types, and the soil where most of the pictures were is really clay and it's really dense. And the one really good site on the upland is a lot more rocky and a lot more aerated. And in neither place do we observe, especially in April when it's frequently pretty wet, do we observe differences in the winter grazed pastures compared to the spring pastures as far as any sort of soil impacts.
Thanks, Ben, for asking those questions. This question is for Casey. Casey, in the last presentation you gave, we learned you're talking to ranchers about early detection in the rural fire protection associations. So are you talking to, are fire people talking to cow people about how to graze strategically?
That's a discussion that, you know, we're kind of is referred to a pilot project we're doing with the collaborative group. When we talk grazing versus targeted grazing. And so, yeah, that discussion is going on, you know, as far as we can have targeted grazing in my mind from the fire perspective and utilizing fuel breaks, if we can associate that along a fence line or tied to some feature to connect the dots. So it could be a tool where a fuel break off a road might patch in between two roads utilizing grazing. And then there's some technologies coming out that are pretty cool, I think, out of Kirk's, you know, the Eastern Oregon Ag Research Center using GPS collars and space age cows. So I think there's some cool stuff coming in the future to help augment targeted grazing.
And Katie, in one of the initial presentations, Megan talked about the importance of coordination. You must see that all the time. Boy, I wish we could do this. And you talked about the length of permits being the 10 years. So tell us about some barriers you'd like to see knocked down and the perfect world you envision where ranchers and agency fire control people are talking to each other.
You want me to talk about my perfect world?
Yes.
Right. So I led a study when I was with the University of Idaho where we looked at, we visited with over 100 grazing permittees and BLM field office staff talking about just what it would take to get flexibility in grazing in those offices. And so there were the usual barriers you'd expect for those kinds of conversations. For example, NEPA is a very real thing that our federal land management agencies must complete. And so in terms of staff capacity and the turnaround time to get things on the ground, it really proves to be challenging to transition from, you know, identifying what needs to be done to actually getting it on the ground in a timely manner. And so, you know, one thing we found, going back to what Casey was saying about creating fuel breaks using grazing, I think a lot of folks on at this workshop today might know that sometimes going through kind of the guise of fuels management is a little more palatable to the public than through grazing administration. So we saw some field offices using that authority kind of through the fuel side of BLM and using targeted grazing as a biological control for weeds or vegetation treatment. And that was a little more socially acceptable for their particular community to get fuel breaks on the ground. In terms of overcoming barriers, you know, kind of unsurprising findings. It's aligned with what Matt Cahill said to us earlier today. You need good permittee agency relationships to get flexibility in grazing. It takes a lot of time to build those relationships. And so we found one barrier to that is simply just staff turnover. When you get a really good rangeland management specialist, it's very possible that they will leave. And so it also takes communication. So a permittee that's willing to go visit the BLM office or get out on the ground and take a look at things. And then co-develop ideas for that allotment. What would make sense given, you know, the condition on the ground? Do they need to make a change to that permit and undergo that lengthy NEPA process we talked about? Another important factor in overcoming barriers was to have work with permittees with good records of stewardship. And again, that might sound quite obvious, but the BLM is a federal agency. They can't escape kind of their statutory requirements. And so being able to document, you know, the kinds of grazing that's taking place on the ground and why it would be appropriate and why this is an appropriate permittee to try new things and experiment with is really important. And then finally, you know, leadership that's comfortable with experimentation is essential to getting some flexibility out there. And that makes a lot of sense because a lot of field offices in the American West get hammered by lawsuits, especially around grazing. And so some BLM staff are understandably adverse to taking a risk, trying new things, you know, getting a 12-month permit out there, you know, might raise a red flag for a litigious public.
Thanks, Katie. 2 questions for you, Bill. You've been around a BLM regulation or 2. How open is your agency to experimentation? I mean, your presentation was about experimentation. And then secondly, are you worried about having enough forbs for sage grouse out there with the winter grazing? Bill?
So far, for number 2, so far we're really not. The heavy clay sites, the forbs we're getting are non-native annuals and native annuals predominantly. So, and it's totally depends on the weather. I think on the other 2 sites, we're getting more perennial forbs coming in, and the key to that is we got to keep it from burning every 4 or 5 years. And as long as we can keep it from repeatedly burning, I think the forbs will do their successional thing. What was the first question again?
How open are you and your agency to experimentation?
So it's all about the people. My immediate supervisor is pretty open to this kind of stuff. I know of other resource areas, as Katie sort of pointed out, there's a huge variation in how much risk a specific field office manager is willing to take. Part of the reason that we have not gotten very much pushback on this particular project is right when we started, we had a tour with interest groups, and it was basically a fabulous Medusa head patch. And so it was a very low priority to their other interests. And so when we did although I whined about how long the NEPA took, we did not get a protest or an appeal of the EA and the permit renewal decision that has now authorized this sort of management. So it's all across the board, and also like Katie said, it depends on how recently you have lost an appeal. So that really raises your risk aversion.
Thanks, Bill. And Katie, back to you with the question on chat. The flexible management program, Mark Owens in the opening session in his presentation talked about the need for certainty out there for these public lands ranchers in order to have that economic base in these rural counties of the West. So how do you have that flexible management program that may require a lot of changes and yet certainty for a year-round forage resource? How do you do both?
Right, and that's really difficult. You know, one thing that I learned from Bill, and I welcome him to jump in on this, is building in kind of like qualitative indicators for situations that might warrant more forage utilization. And so it's in the Burns district, it sounds like when they renewed their allotment management plans, they specified, you know, when there's this much precipitation and this much growth, the permittees, you know, in these areas can have temporary non-renewable grass, basically. And so that's one way to respond to the annual changes in precipitation. In terms of predictability, I mean, that's the challenge of being a rancher in the high desert, right? And so, you know, I would remind us, when it burns, you know, you're not going to have forage for a couple years. And so one thing I know we're also trying in the area is grass banking. And so, you know, maybe developing a network. I know there are already informal ones, but ways to, you know, track down grass as needed might be an option for that too. Bill, did you want to add to that comment about the allotment management plans?
I'd like to address the predictability a little more. And I think this goes with a point that has been made numerous times already today. Predictability is going to be different for every rancher. Some ranchers may have determined that they need to sell 500 calves a year to make their budget work. So they don't care if that takes 1,000 cows or if it takes 600 cows. Other people have a really flexible business model, and maybe some years if things are better, they can buy feeder calves, and other years maybe they have some an arrangement with their neighbor who can take a few of their cows. It's real case by case. And so in order to really successfully get to that, once again, it isn't a one size fits all. It's an indication of how well we are communicating with the permittees ahead of time and how well we can incorporate that into their BLM permits.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Katie. Kirk, this question is for you. One of the earlier presenters showed a precipitation history, and it's obvious that in Harney County, you've never had an average year of precipitation. And yet you talked about how after years of heavy precipitation, that's when the buildup of fuels occur. Give your input as to how agencies and ranchers should cooperate to manage the peaks and valleys of supply and demand of forage on the BLM land.
Wow, I think you're throwing me under the bus there. So, you know, that's really something that I think Bill's really hit on, that it's that relationship between them that makes this all possible. And that's how it's going to be done and how it's going to be managed in the future. And there is going to be people that don't have the flexibility to manage extra fuels. And that's a risk we're going to have to live with. And that's where a strategic plan, where you have people that you can work with or can do these kind of things, that you use them to maximize the benefit you get from applying extended, growing seed or extended use grazing and stuff to try to reduce fuels in strategic areas. It's not something we can apply everywhere, nor would we want to.
Good comment. I'd like to go into final thoughts now. Let's begin with Casey and then go to Bill. What are the key takeaways you want people to get from this panel presentation?
Yeah, I guess key takeaway for me would be that grazing is just another one of the tools in the toolbox, and if used appropriately, it is something that helps with the that fire triangle I was referring to earlier. It helps manage fuels and fuel loading on sage steppe vegetation.
Thanks, Casey. Bill, then Katie. Bill, your final thoughts.
So invasive annual grasses are a huge landscape scale problem in the Northern Great Basin. Livestock grazing is by far the largest scale land use, and it certainly is on BLM land. And so we have to figure out how to merge these 2 points together to help control invasive annual grasses and favor succession towards more perennial native plant communities.
Thanks, Bill. Katie, and then Kirk. Katie?
I'll second what Bill said. Livestock are a widespread resource on this landscape. And so in order to synergistically leverage them to help with fuels management efforts, we need to figure out how to go from, what studies like Kirk show with grazing and effects on fuels and moisture content and ignition probability to something we can do at a widespread scale.
Thanks, Katie. And before we go to Kirk, people want to know how old your dog is and what's his name.
That's Stella. She's 8. She's being quiet.
Okay, she's a rapt listener. Kirk, final thoughts.
I really like to echo what everyone said, that they really made some really good points. And to add on top of that, I think that we've constantly thought of grazing just as a resource use. And I think we're switching, and we need to switch to a culture where we also recognize that it has benefits. And if we maximize the benefits from it, we can hopefully create more healthy ecosystems. And that, being said, is within the bounds of, good management. We don't want to create some of the problems we're trying to avoid by, managing fuels.
Great. Thank the 4 of you. A very good presentation and great ending comments, Kirk. And with that, we're going to move right into ratcheting up resiliency. On this panel, we have Chad, and then Dustin Johnson, Dustin Smith, and Rory O'Connor. We're going to start with a PowerPoint from Dustin. And with that, Dustin, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. First, Jack, can you hear me all right? Just want to make sure.
Yeah, very clear, very good. And your slide's up, and it's a dandy slide.
All right. You should recognize that picture, by the way.
Yeah, I guess so, yeah.
So as you mentioned, Jack, so I'm on this panel with 3 other colleagues. And so, again, those include Chad Boyd, Rory O'Connor, and Dustin Smith. And so actually 3 of us are participating here at the Eastern Oregon Ag Research Center where we work, Chad, Rory, and myself. And we've experienced a few bandwidth issues here at the station. So we've actually, we're participating all in the same room in our large conference room with appropriate social distancing here. So, and we're all going to participate via my computer here, just a heads up on that. So I guess the first thing I'd like to do is just to thank everyone for hanging in there with us as we sort of round out today's program. You've all experienced a lot of screen time today, and you've had the opportunity to hear from these really great panels and these presentations. I know I've learned a lot, but you have hung in there, so I appreciate that. So my job here to kind of kick things off is to basically set the table for this panel discussion of some considerations that we can think about for promoting the resilience of sagebrush rangelands and to fire specifically. So you've probably already figured this out by now, but it's really hard to talk about invasive annual grasses as an issue without also talking about wildfire. And these issues are so connected that it's difficult to imagine how we might make any progress in tackling invasive annual grasses without first figuring out how to gain some meaningful influence over the occurrence and outcomes associated with wildfire. And that's really why we have the focus that we do today. And that's why, this is called an invasive annual grass workshop. But as you're finding today, it's really should be called an invasive annual grass / wildfire workshop because those issues are so intertwined. And so I thought a good place to start for us would be just to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of what exactly ecosystem resilience is. And so I took a look at definitions for ecosystem resilience that were available in the scientific literature, when I was preparing this slide deck for this part of it. And I found, probably not surprisingly, I found that there are several. And so this concept of resilience in many ways seems to be sort of an evolving concept. And definitions seem to differ, and this shouldn't be surprising either probably, but based on the perspective from which it comes. And so I picked out a couple of definitions from the literature that I think do a pretty good job of reflecting the way I think about ecosystem resilience. And I'd like to share those with you, but first I'm hoping to hear some of your thoughts or at least see them. And so before I share my definitions and sort of bias you in any way, I'd like for you to use the chat box to share your working definition of ecosystem resilience. And so I'm hoping you're doing that now, because I'm not going to give you too long to actually put that in the chat box before I share my thoughts. And if you can't come up with a working definition off the top of your head, you can just maybe put in some key words that are sort of reflective of at least some of the principles that you think about when you think about resilience. So again, I hope you're entering that in the chat box. And so I'm hoping to start a discussion around that. And then maybe we can build on that in our panel discussion as well. So to me, at its core, ecosystem resilience is really about how the ecosystem responds to some sort of a stressor or disturbance. So as an ecologist, range ecologist, I really like this first definition of ecosystem resilience that refers to a system's ability to maintain structure and functions that promote important processes in the face of disturbances to that system. And I know that in my training, Dr. Lee Edelman, for those of you who might know him, he's a retired range professor at OSU, really just pounded into me that ecology is really about structure, function, and process. So I think that's why that definition really appeals to me. But that really doesn't go far enough, because if we think about it, if we use this definition, one of the most resilient systems that we have is actually an invasive annual grassland. There's almost 100% chance if that system experiences disturbance, it's going to actually come back with those same the same structure, function, and process. So it really doesn't go far enough. And so the part that it's missing is really that human dimension, or the values piece of this that we associate with rangeland. We're all involved in rangeland in the management of rangeland in some way, and we're managing those rangelands to produce values or ecosystem services. So I really like the second definition of ecosystem resilience also, and it's really the ability of the ecosystem to maintain desirable ecosystem services in the face of disturbance. And so, I think a melding of these two is really where I'm at in terms of how I think about ecosystem resilience. So hopefully you're entering your thoughts into the chat box as we go through this. So if we can all agree that maintaining ecosystem resilience is important, I think we can all do that, then their question really becomes, how do we manage for something like ecosystem resilience? Or put another way, how do we go about ratcheting up resiliency? And so first, I think it's important to consider what factors actually influence the ecosystem's ability to respond to stressors or disturbances like wildfire. So when I consider this, I tend to think about two major categories of factors. First, I think we all recognize that resilience can vary markedly with abiotic or physical properties of the ecosystem, where in fact resilience tends to decrease with decreasing elevation. Now, there are other factors influencing a site's soil temperature and moisture regimes, which is really what we're talking about, such as aspect and soil texture and depth, also play important roles, and whereby warmer, drier sites inherently tend to offer less resilience than cooler, moisture sites. I think it's also important to acknowledge that resilience is not static over time either. A system can respond to wildfire, for example, very differently depending on the climatic conditions that occur before and after the fire, which is I know is something that actually Rory would like to touch on later on in the panel discussion. In addition, resilience is also very likely changing with longer term climatic trends toward warmer and drier conditions. We're just seeing cheatgrass in areas at elevations where we just didn't see it be as a problem before. We're just seeing more and more of that. So although it's really important to account for these abiotic or physical properties that impact ecosystem resiliency when making management decisions, they're really not something that we can directly influence from a practical sense. It's really kind of just a hand that we're dealt as rangeland managers. With that said, it would sure be nice to be able to magically increase the elevation of annual grass prone areas by 2,000 or 3,000 feet. That would solve a lot of our issues, but that's obviously not something that's going to happen. So therefore, we're left with managing sort of the other category factors that influence resiliency, which are the biotic properties of the ecosystem. And if we focus on vegetation as a primary biotic property of the sagebrush ecosystem, we know that plant communities are composed of varying amounts of shrubs, forbs, perennial bunch grasses, and unfortunately, increasingly invasive annual grasses. And it's really the relative composition and interaction of these different types of vegetation that have a large influence on how plant communities respond to disturbances like wildfire. And really, we must look at what's going on underneath the soil surface or underground to fully understand how vegetation interacts with resilience and what types of vegetation may have the most influence on ecosystem resilience. So if we take a look at a typical sagebrush plant community, like what's shown here in this plant display, and you've seen this often today throughout this program, we see that it's the grasses that have the largest root masses, and therefore it's the grasses that are most important for tying up resources and making those resources unavailable to invasive annual grasses. And I think there's this a bit of a common, maybe a misconception that invasive annual grasses are somehow these super competitors, and where in fact invasive annual grasses are honestly fairly pathetic when it comes to competing for resources, when they're competing for those resources with large, mature perennial bunch grasses. I think, you know, Jeremy earlier in a panel discussion kind of mentioned this. I think this graphic that I borrowed from the Sagebrush Initiative folks does a really nice job of illustrating why. I mean, if you look at the root masses associated with perennial grasses versus annual grasses, who are you going to pick as a winner when it comes to competing for resources? Okay, I threw this picture in just to illustrate that not only do large mature bunch grasses play an important role in uptaking and therefore tying up resources and making them unavailable to the invasive plants that we're worried about, but they're also, depending on fuels and some other conditions, I think Chad would like to touch on later, these grasses are often better positioned to survive wildfire when compared to more fire intolerant plants like sagebrush. So these are the guys that are going to be there after the fire. You know, we normally see a flush in resources after a disturbance event like a fire, which is just prime for invasive annual grass to take advantage of. But when these guys survive the fire and they're there, they're actually tying up those resources again and making them unavailable to the invasive annual grasses. So the challenge we have before us in relative to this idea of ratcheting up resiliency is pretty easy to define. And that is higher perennial bunch grass abundance normally equals higher ecosystem resilience. And of course, the reverse is also true, where lower perennial grass abundance leads to lower ecosystem resilience. And again, the problem's easy to define, but as it turns out, solutions are a little harder to come by, and particularly when we're talking about those warmer, drier, lower elevation, therefore lower resilience type areas within the ecosystem that are prone to annual grasses. Okay, so I just want to end up with this slide. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to set the table with these thoughts. And the first one is resilience is influenced by abiotic or site factors and biotic or plant community factors. And resilience is not static, and it varies depending on location within the ecosystem and over time, largely with weather and climatic trends and conditions. one important thing here is we can manage biotic factors. We can manage the plant community. We can manage fuels. That is something we can influence as it relates to resilience. And again, I'll just end up by saying that perennial bunch grasses are key to maintaining ecosystem resilience. You've heard that many times today, and you'll probably hear it more as we go through the program. So I'd like to end with that, and I'll kick it back over to you, Jack.
Thanks, Dustin. Who in your room would like to go next, or should we go to Twin Falls, Dustin?
Rory looks like he's up for going next.
Okay, sounds good. For those of you who don't know, Rory is a range ecologist with the Ag Research Service in Burns. Rory, go ahead if you would.
Yeah, so move the microphone closer. Yeah, so as Dustin pointed out, the abiotic component for rangelands, especially here in Harney County in Eastern Oregon, never really hits its mean precipitation more than once every few years. And that makes it really difficult for after the fires happen to revegetate. And what's really interesting is every time we try to seed after a fire or a year after the fire, we always have a failure of establishment of perennial grasses, perennial forbs, and sagebrush. And that becomes a problem when we try to talk about the resiliency of a landscape. And as Matt Cahill mentioned, in a native natural environment where it's a healthy ecosystem, we might have a regeneration of every 10 years for perennial species. And we have to find innovative ways to revegetate after fires to increase our ability to skew the resilience of a site towards our favor. And some of that is understanding what thresholds or what things detract from the ability to revegetate. And some of that is linked to understanding individual species threshold for its water use, for its temperature, and with increasing climate variability, we're getting warmer winters that can be really wet or they can be extremely dry. And those conditions will influence our ability to revegetate. And we have to use all the tools available to us, whether it's, doing serial seedings or having seed coatings that delay seed germination, things that I'm sure are going to come up in tomorrow's talk, using herbicides. We have to use all available tools to offset what abiotic constraints we're currently experiencing. So I'll leave it at that because I know there's some. I know Dustin over in Twin Falls has some things to talk about of post-fire restoration.
Okay, thanks, Rory. We'll go to Dustin in Twin Falls next. Dustin Smith's a fire ecologist for the BLM in the Twin Falls district near Burley. Dustin, it's all yours.
Thanks, Jack. I appreciate it. And then thanks, Dustin Johnson, for setting this up, or setting this discussion up. With the post-fire, the rehabilitation of an area, you have to consider so many different things. And I think, with the, I guess the knowledge of what has been successful in the past, what hasn't, the different factors, soil type, elevation, what's our moisture in the area that's burned, what's going to give that area the best chance, or what species can we use to give the area the best chance to reestablish or even to outcompete the invasive annuals. I think at times we'd like to put certain species in the ground. We'd like to see certain things grow, but I think sometimes an area may be too far gone or maybe on that threshold that we got to put something in the ground that we know that's going to establish, it's going to outcompete the cheatgrass, and it's going to give us the best chance to get those resources, the chance to reuse this area or to get the best use out of that. So a lot of different things. There's even things that, you know, depending on the fire, we talked a lot about wildfire. I think we got to look at the fire severity. How hot did it burn? Did it completely just annihilate everything? Is there still components of bunch grasses there? Was it a mosaic burn? Was it a complete, you know, I use the term moonscape. Did it completely remove everything from the area? This year we had an area that was a mosaic burn. There was a lot of good mosses, lichens on the ground. We didn't feel like that if we did, or we felt like that if we did disturb that area and disrupted the lichens and the mosses, we'd open up the area for cheatgrass, looking at the surrounding, what was around the area before it burned or was in the neighboring area, what conditions are there. So it's obviously a lot of factors. I think we've been talking about the factors throughout this discussion this afternoon. So yeah, I'll stop there and we'll see where different questions take us.
Thanks, Dustin. Chad, your turn to take a swing at this.
Sure, Jack. Thank you, and thank you for facilitating. This has really been a good meeting, both in terms of the topics, and we were talking between sessions, also in terms of having these facilitated panels where we're not just going to a meeting and listening to a bunch of talks, but we're actually being able to ask questions, even though it's virtual. And I really like the facilitated format. So to me, in terms of maintaining resiliency in an annual grass world with a lot of fire in it, it really comes back to what is the effect of fire on perennial bunch grasses. I thought Dustin and others have done a good job of establishing the importance of perennial bunch grasses to resiliency of a plant community. And we've done a bit of work on that. And Dustin just made a few comments on that as well. But when I think about wildfire, the work that we have done is somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 60% bunchgrass mortality. That data comes mainly from the Miller Homestead fire. There's some other published work out there as well, but we did some work on the Miller Homestead fire. Lose between 20 and 60%, depending on the site, of bunch grasses in a fire. And the point that I would make on that is I think that's enough to be a problem. It's not enough to convert a otherwise pre-fire functioning, healthy, so to speak, sagebrush bunchgrass plant community to an annual grass community in a single fire. But what it does is it takes you a step down the stairwell, and at the bottom of the stairwell, if you burn enough, is an annual grass community. So perennial bunchgrass mortality is definitely a factor with fire. And the next question starts to become how are those which grasses are dying? That'd be a good way to say it. And when I say which grasses are dying, I mean specifically where are they located, and does that give us clues as to differential susceptibility of these plants to fire? And another thing that we found through various studies is that about 90% of those 20 to 60% of the plants that die in fire, about 90% of those are under the drip line of a sagebrush. And it really gets to the differential roles of what I think of as roles of grasses versus shrubs in fire. Shrubs make fire hot, grasses carry fire from shrub to shrub. And what we found is that if you're going to get enough heat to kill a perennial bunchgrass, it's probably not going to be in an interspace location. It's going to be in the direct vicinity of a shrub. Grasses alone just don't generate enough heat for long enough, and that's the key part of this, for long enough to have the thermal impact to kill those the perennial bunchgrasses. So one conclusion from what I've just said might be, well, if we just get rid of the shrubs, then we're not going to have a loss of perennial bunchgrasses. Well, that's got obvious problems. We could have, and they go beyond just sage-grouse and other values associated with the plant community, and they get to the ecology of the plant community. Shrubs play vital roles in these plant communities. We could have a whole conference on the importance of shrubs. So I'm not saying that we need to remove the shrubs, but I think it's fair to ask, how many shrubs do we need? And are we pre-positioning plant communities to have a negative outcome with fire if we have too many shrubs relative to the perennial bunchgrass population. Another question that comes up is, okay, given that, if that's true, what percentage of shrub cover do we need to reduce down to? And I always hate that question, because I would rather institutionalize principles that are backed by data rather than the numbers that are within the data. That's where we tend to break down and quit thinking, is when we focus on a number. But I think it's fair to say that we've got quite a few plant communities that haven't yet experienced fire that do have what I would think of as a growing overabundance of shrubs. And again, based on our research, we have a pretty good idea of how that's going to affect the plant community in terms of mortality of perennial bunch grasses and consequent loss of resiliency during fire. And I think I'll leave it right there for right now, Dustin.
Thanks, Chad. We have a question from Megan who'd like to know the difference in, I think she means mortality, on prescribed fire and wildfire.
Yeah, I think the biggest difference is that you're going to be able to select the conditions under which things burn, which, as Casey has pointed out, has a huge impact on how the fire burns. You know, if you're, for example, wanting to use prescribed fire to, let's say you want to reduce shrubs, but you'd also not like to end up with an annual grass plant community at the end of it. You could begin to think about a cool fire weather prescription for that burn, so that you didn't have complete combustion of those shrubs. And as you subtract shrubs out of the fire equation, you subtract heat energy out of the fire equation, and you can reduce the mortality of the perennial bunch grasses.
Thanks, Chad. Dustin, in your presentation, you talked about resilience and the ability to bounce back with the same functions and processes and species and components. But should there be an ability to adapt as well? If we are having a changing climate, do we need to think more of adaptation rather than resilience? We certainly do with economies. Why not with ecosystems? Dustin?
Yeah, that's a good question. By the way, I really appreciate folks putting their thoughts about resilience in the chat. I looked through some of those, and there are some common themes throughout that. And as you mentioned, Jack, a lot of those are around this idea of bouncing back. But yeah, I think you're right. I mean, conditions are changing. You know, I mentioned that we're seeing these invasive annual grasses at elevations now that we haven't really seen them before, where they were previously not as problematic anyway. And you know, I think a lot of that's being confirmed with, you know, a lot of remote sensing work that we're doing as well. So I know there's some folks, and I'll ask, Rory may know more about this than I do, and probably does actually. There are some folks that are considering, you know, how do we look out with changing climatic trends, you know, to perhaps warmer, drier conditions, and how do we use that information to better do preemptive kind of restoration type actions by, you know, the plant materials, for example, that we select. Maybe we need to select plant materials that that do better under more, you know, droughty conditions and that sort of thing. So, I mean, that is a consideration, and I think it's a good question. Do you have anything to add, Rory?
Yeah, so I know with the USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey, I've been a part of a working group that has been developing a module for the long-term, let me get the right word, the land treatment exploration tool, which the BLM uses and some other Department of Interior agencies use to institute treatments following fires, or even do prescribed treatments. And in part of that, we're coming out in March, hopefully, we'll have a ecological drought tool that will be made available where people can input their site and look at how the long-term trends of weather and climate are going to be influencing that site, and how that relates to seeding projects. And so that's going to be coming out, and there's a lot of people looking into which species to use. Should we be using, you know, a certain variety of blue bunch wheatgrass that is in southern Utah and put it up here? There's people there is ongoing research in that area within the Ag Research Service, within the university systems at Utah State, University of Nevada, Reno, Oregon State, and the U.S. Geological Survey. So there is work going into understanding how those different plant communities that we can use to adapt to our local areas and how it's going to change in the future.
Thanks, Roy. Dustin and Chad, this question is to both of you. Craig would like to know, are you looking far enough and wide enough for ideas for restoration solutions? Or do you think you're too closed in with other BLM and ag researchers? Dustin and then Chad.
All right, so Dustin Johnson or Dustin Smith?
Smith. Oh. I'm sorry.
No, that's all right.
Okay, Jack, sorry, you don't have to have you repeat that because I thought it was directed to Dustin Johnson.
So are you looking wide enough for ideas for restoring these ecosystems after they've been burned? Craig was wondering, is it too much in-house? Is it too much closed circle for your ideas?
No, I mean, I think we're taking into account our neighbors, you know, private, state, other federal. What are they doing? What has worked for them? And what is, you know, are there things that we can adapt that they've used that we haven't, that has been successful? And, you know, I think there's different things that work and certain things that don't. And I feel like we're not always running to a fire and saying we have to do something. We have to, you know, it all depends on what was the area condition before it burned. Was it in good health? Was there, you know, was there a lot of invasives? Was there a lot of shrubs? Was it, you know, was it something that hasn't burned in a long time? Something we don't have history of it ever burning. And it all depends on a few of those things. And you can tell if an area needs to be restored or rehabbed, or you can, you know, you're going to have good key factors that are going to tell you, you probably get just okay to leave it alone. It'll restore on its own. And we've done both, and we've done, you know, where we've left it, and maybe a couple years later, like maybe that wasn't the right decision, but we still have tools that we can go back and do restoration in, you know, years past the fire. And I think there's a lot of different things that you can use, but I feel like you have to look, like you said, beyond just immediately what's in front of you.
Sure. Chad, how would you answer that? Are you restoration solutions? Are you looking far enough, wide enough? Do you have lots of things to experiment on?
Yeah, we don't have a shortage there. Jack, what I would say is I don't look at this as a customer-centric problem at all. Resiliency matters to fill in the blank. You know, if you're talking about grazing, resiliency matters. If you're talking about sage-grouse, resiliency matters. Resiliency matters to native plants and associated values, to recreation. It matters to wilderness experience. It matters to all of those things. And what we do is we like to take I like to take a step back and not think about the customer, but think about the ecosystem. One of the things that we've learned through working with various sage-grouse management efforts, and one of the things that we preach repeatedly is, well, in that case, I would say that we didn't and we don't have a sage-grouse problem. What we have is a sagebrush ecosystem problem, one of the symptoms of which is that sage-grouse are not doing as well as they could be. So that's kind of how I look at this. I think that when you take the ecosystem management approach and when you use applied ecosystem science to help build that resiliency, you are doing things that are going to impact a wide berth of both values and uses of the land.
Thanks, Chad. Dustin Johnson, Megan wanted to know, is prescribed fire still used in Oregon rangelands, or is all fire considered bad now? Prescribed or wild?
Right. No, that's a great question. And no, as I think Chad mentioned in the opening remarks today, that not all fire is bad. Fire's been, you know, a natural part of the ecosystem. And so not all fire is bad. And so, you know, we at lower elevations, you know, where the resiliency tends to be lower, these warmer, drier areas, I would say fire is normally bad in those areas, just because they are annual grass prone. Those are the areas where annual grasses really thrive. But if we move up in elevation, you know, we're kind of dealing with a different problem. And, you know, we're in that case, we're dealing with, in many ways, a lack of fire and encroachment by juniper. And I would say in, you know, those higher elevation areas, prescribed fire is certainly a tool that we can still consider using. In fact, we've done a bit of research on that, looking at, you know, some of the treatment methods for Western juniper encroachment, looking at cutting versus fire. And, you know, fire gains you quite a bit in certain circumstances. I think it's like any other tool that you might apply. You just have to be mindful of the conditions you're applying it to and the location within the ecosystem, you know, and having that understanding of what the relative risks are of annual grasses or creating other issues that you don't want. So that would be my answer. Do you guys have anything to add to that? Good.
Rory, Craig would like to know if you're doing anything with forbs. Dustin mentioned how perennial grasses are a keystone species. How about forbs? Do you need to be working with them?
Obviously, I'm sure Chad will know a little bit more on this with some of the work that he's been doing with the Nature Conservancy or Matt Cahill, but forbs obviously are very important in the system. I mean, they provide some good nutrients for cattle, but they also provide a lot of excellent forage for the sage grouse and other wildlife species. So they are critical. Most seed mixes add forbs into them, but I'm sure Chad can mention some more things with what he's been doing with seeding projects.
Yeah, I think with respect to the topic, Jack, and I think all of us would probably wholeheartedly agree with the idea that forbs are very important for a number of reasons. To me, resiliency is not one of those reasons. I think that, and it goes back to the root diagram or the picture, take your pick. Looking at the mass of roots that we have that are associated with perennial bunch grasses. Again, that's why we promote perennial bunch grass management when we're talking about resiliency, is because that's really the species that in this altered ecosystem that we live in is going to play the biggest role in helping to minimize the presence of annuals and to increase the resiliency to things like fire and the negative effects of fire with respect to the subsequent invasion or increase in annuals that we typically see post-fire. That's really the functional group that's going to do that. And again, nothing against forbs. Forb abundance tends to be controlled by a lot of things like that are abiotic, that are difficult to manage for as well. And so, anyways, that's kind of where I would stand on that, Jack.
Okay, thank you. And I'm not seeing any other questions on chat. So what I'd like are your final thoughts, your key takeaways that you want people to leave here with about trying to maintain the resiliency of these arid rangeland ecosystems. Let's start with Rory and then go to Dustin. Rory, what are the key takeaways?
My key takeaway is we need to use all available tools in our toolbox. You know, we need to be able to plan for, you know, the years where we're dry and the years where we're wet, and be able to have that flexibility within our toolbox to be able to, you know, potentially use, say, some more deferred grazing or some additional seeding trials on the landscape to help ratchet up our resiliency with perennial grasses on the landscape.
Thanks. That was well said, Rory, and it really ties into what Katie and Bill and Kirk were saying in the prior presentation. Dustin and then Chad. Dustin, your key takeaways.
Sure. So first, thanks everyone for bearing with us with our as we're trying to deal with network issues and having the camera off and all that stuff. So appreciate it. So I'd like to build on something Dustin Smith actually said, and that's really around this idea of knowing what conditions you're dealing with. It's really hard to know how to manage if you don't know what those conditions are. And I would add to that, in addition, you also need to understand how those conditions may be changing in order to know what to do as we think about increasing resiliency. If you don't know what you're managing, you don't know what to do on that. So I think there are a lot of tools. Megan talked about some that she's been working on. We have the range analysis platform that gets us a long way very efficiently in understanding what our conditions are that we're dealing with. And so I would just encourage folks to take advantage of that and not only understanding what the conditions are, but how they relate to resiliency to wildfire and ultimately invasive annual grasses. Again, I can't stress enough that understanding what you're dealing with is of utmost importance.
Thanks, Dustin. And then Chad, and then the final word to Dustin Smith. Chad, your takeaways.
Sure. And this is this is a repeat of what Dustin said earlier, but I think it bears repeating, and that is that resiliency has both a abiotic and abiotic component. Both are important, but only one can be managed for its scale, and that's the biotic component. In managing for that biotic component, managing for resilience is really a force multiplier in time that helps us to do what we can to help predetermine a plant community's response to disturbances such as fire. And lastly, I would also add that I think we're getting to the point where we're getting beyond, this used to be a knowledge limited question. And I'm not saying that we know everything we need to know about managing for biotic resilience, but I think that we know enough to begin management and to begin adaptive management. And I think that that's pretty exciting. I'll leave it there, Jack.
Okay, and Dustin Smith.
Yeah, man, what hasn't been said already, the resilience, the capacity to recover quickly. What can we do to pre-fire to make an area recover quickly? And what can we do to an area that is post-fire to recover quickly? And looking at both sides, not waiting for something to burn in a wildfire, but helping it along before that happens to even increase the chances of it being resilient or increasing the chances for it to recover quickly. I think there's both sides of the coin there that we can be looking at things to do pre and post fire.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Dustin Smith, Dustin Johnson, Chad and Rory. Excellent presentation. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Brad. Brad, I notice there's still close to 175 people listening. And of course, we all know why. They want some more of that high desert swag. So Brad, I'll turn it over back to you.
Well, Jack, I was going to ask you to stay on for 1 minute. And I was going to ask, compliment you on such a fantastic job moderating all of these panels with, all of these great professionals. But secondly, you ask a question of everybody for final thoughts, and nobody asked you for your final thoughts. And I'd like to know what your final thoughts were today in listening to all of these panelists.
One thing that struck me, Brad, is that the humility that people are approaching this. No one came across saying, gosh, I know the answer. This is the way we'll do it. There's a lot of unanswered questions out there. People want to be careful in their approach. But they're also willing to do some experimentation and learn from that experimentation. I think there's a really healthy attitude going on in the management and education and increasing knowledge about southeastern Oregon, Great Basin rangelands. It's been a pleasure to listen to the presenters today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Ben, we are actually ahead of schedule here. If there are any final comments, anybody has a final question, I think please put it into the chat. We will make every effort to address it. And if not, I agree with Jack, Ben, people want swag. And you are the swag guy.
Good guy. So let's see, let me do the random number generator here. And it lands on Bonnie Rasmussen. Looks like works for Oregon Department of Ag. And looks like Bonnie is still with us. So I guess Bonnie, if you want to come off mute and tell us where you're from, I meant to do that with the last one and I didn't get to hear.
What did Bonnie win?
Oh, sorry. Yes. What did Bonnie win? Bonnie won the High Desert Partnership package. So a hat, this nice silicone travel dog dish that you can smash up and take with you, Silly Pint, and a $40 gift card to Biz Harney or to
Shop Harney.
Yeah, Shop Harney.
Harney. I think there's about 65 merchants you can purchase products from in Harney County now, using that local gift card and keeping all of the funds local.
That's
Cool.
awesome. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Well, that'll work really perfect because I am based out of Harney County. So that works absolutely perfect. Yeah,
Great.
I'm down here in Burns.
Don't even have to wait for COVID to end.
There you go.
Megan wants to know if High Desert Partnership is a dog boarding service. And I think, High Desert Partnership has its fingers in a lot of different things. We'd have to ask Brenda Smith if that's something on their agenda going forward.
Well, we certainly all have a lot of dogs here at the office, so we're dog fans. Brenda might sign up to be a dog boarding service temporarily. She got a nice dog. So that is it.
Tomorrow at 8:30 for more. Grow the Core, reclaiming it at risk and converted lands, pulling it all together and plotting a path forward. So I think it's been a tremendous group of people. It's been a wonderful job by everybody. Thank you. So look at that too, Carrie. That is amazing. And we're looking forward to this tomorrow. Please be here and thank you so much. But take a minute to take a look at this graphic representation of what we just all learned today.
Very cool.
Ben, anything else?
Nothing else for me, except there's some questions about this graphic and it will be shared with everyone after the workshop. So you'll get a chance to see it close up later.
Wonderful, everybody. Thank you so much. Stay safe. Have a wonderful evening and we'll see everybody tomorrow at 8:30 in the morning.